call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for February 18th to order. And there's one item on the agenda besides council comments and dispositions and communications. That is the Ames 2040 plan update. So I'll turn it over to Kelly and Marty and let them guide the conversation.
All right. So we sent out a draft presentation on Friday to kind of give you a chance to see a lot more detailed stuff than we really want to go through tonight. So to help you focus when we get to the housing principles, there's 4 slides in a row right there. That's what we want to focus on as the first half of the meeting or the first part of the meeting. And Marty's going to go through that discussion with you. And then later on, when we get to land use classifications, again, there's table after table giving you the background. We weren't expecting to go through the nuances of that, but we definitely have some issues we want you to talk about that concept.
I forgot to get draft presentation taken off, but
I thought I changed that on that.
no, you did and I didn't because it's a different copy. But
Okay.
yeah.
So like I said, housing policy is the big one, and then the land use classifications help us move ahead to get you a whole citywide map for that. A lot of the slides we gave you on Friday were background. We're not going to go through that. Marty did go through and add some new information that you did not get to give you some context to the housing unit types and kind of the income levels that help lead you to understand what that unit mix is. That might be one way of looking at this. I think I articulated that roughly 6,400 units was the 20-year 1.5% growth number. And then Marty's going to go through a little more information and kind of a way to kind of slice that apart to think about owner occupied versus rental. And then also kind of think about what that product mix is by income level. So it helped give you a little more context. You're not necessarily giving policy direction on that, but it gives you some context before the housing principles. So again, this is the first 3 slides here. This one and the next 2 are slides that you had in December. Again, background and context, land use and growth principles. If you want to go back to those, we can. We weren't going to go through those again tonight. This was the growth projection that we looked at a year ago to establish where we're headed for the Ames Plan 2040. And then this is where I'm going to get back to Marty. So Marty's put a series of tables here together. You don't necessarily have to question all the details here. It's going to get you to an answer of what that mix of units is that fits within the 6,400. I'll give that over to Marty now.
So there's a whole methodology that we go through, and we'll kind of summarize what it means and how we arrive at the various articulation of needs. We start out with, first of all, looking at the income distribution of Ames per household, and this is using 2018 American Community Survey data. So it's the newest stuff that we've got based on a 5-year average. And in this table, we take the various income brackets within the ACS and then match those with a range of housing costs that's affordable, basically fits under the 30% of adjusted gross income criterion for affordability. So, and you'll see that we're going to match those up in a minute and see where there are surpluses and shortages in the market, which then helps lead us to being able to express what's going on in the housing market where we need to go. So, couple of observations in this distribution that we're showing a very high percentage of households under $25,000 a year. That's students, obviously, or a good deal of that is students, and yet in a lot of places we'll take the student population out, but because they're loading the housing market in Ames, we really can't do that because they are a factor in the overall in the overall market. So that seems to depress the number of people at the higher end of the scale because there's this big chunk of quote low income households who are actually the student population. So then
Can you go back?
Yeah, sure.
So how do you reconcile the fact that there's probably not a lot of rentals for less than $500 or under $500? I mean, is that important or not important? I understand how you have
a lot of households there.
a lot of households, but the point is, I don't think that there's many. There may be some, but not many places that are rented for $500.
There aren't. You'll see that in a minute. Okay. All right. So now so here it is. So in this table, we now take those affordability ranges and income ranges and match those with a number of units that fall within the categories that are available to them. So if you look at the number that's under $500, the number of the imbalance of number of households in that range and the number of housing units that are available in that range is enormous, 6,000 of them. So, again, that doesn't necessarily mean people are sleeping in the street, because we're largely talking about student populations, and they're borrowing money, or they're subsidized by parents or by people living together and so forth. But nevertheless, that's where you see these big negative factors.
Do you account for on-campus housing in
No.
this number? Okay,
No,
so that just doesn't exist.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because for the purposes of census, they're considered group quarters. So they are not, so they're what, 11,000?
Roughly.
Yeah.
I think when I was thinking through different quotes from the university, roughly somewhere between 10 and 12,000 students are housed in university housing. And so that gets in our total population, but it doesn't get counted as households. So that's the big distinction tonight. We're just talking about households, not total city population.
And Kelly, is a household defined as a rooftop or a apartment unit, or how is that
It is any dwelling unit.
that
so-
exists in that city right now?
Yeah, so
Yep.
the number of occupied dwelling units that are independent dwelling units, the number of households are the same. So
And-
a household is a grouping of whatever size, related or not, that is occupying a housing unit.
so
So people in nursing homes are not counted so there's a non-household population in the census. So that's people in group quarters. So that's going to be college dorms, nursing homes, prisons, other sorts of settings that are not independent dwelling units.
So a 24-plex would be 24 households per this classification, is that right?
yes,
That's
and then,
correct.
and the other thing that's interesting is when you start to talk about like student housing, the trend in the last 5 years to do 4-bedroom suites and the rent by bedroom model, that's still one unit.
One unit.
Yes.
So that's where the census is going to capture those.
So one of the things that's really interesting here is the surplus of units at the kind of lower end of the scale, which is a very interesting phenomenon that we actually do see that in a lot of places, and I'll explain why in a minute. But you notice that when you compare the population with earnings between $25,000 and $75,000 and the number of units who really kind of demand or are filled with that population, or are paired with that population, there are far more units in that range than there are households. What does that mean? It means that people like to pay less than 30% of their income for housing if they possibly can. And that becomes a significant issue in a housing market, because these units are, in theory, being occupied by people who don't need to. The affordable units are occupied by people who don't need to be living in the affordable units. But it's very hard to tell people, sorry, you're paying too little for your unit, so we're going to kick you out and make you live in a more expensive house, even though you can afford it. And so we'll see the implications of that as we move through the numbers. On the other hand, you see a negative balance on the upper end of the scale, or the kind of middle upper end of the scale. So here we get into the kind of missing middle, well, the sort of lower and then market and upper market ranges. So we've got an overage of units in the so-called middle ranges that are being occupied by people who could potentially afford more, and it tends to create a weirdness or an imbalance in the market. It's a very common phenomenon, and it's mainly because if you're in a decent house and you're not paying a whole lot, you're going to tend to stay there, and we don't have a command economy where we can tell people, you've got to move into something more expensive. So now now we go a little bit farther into it, and we look forward. And in this table, we are breaking down the demand that we have for units, which is roughly 6,400 over the next 20 years, into various affordability ranges. Doesn't mean we can produce that housing, but if we were to build all new housing and we were to apportion it in the same distribution as Ames population is broken up now in terms of income ranges, this is what we would need to be able to make a perfect one-to-one match to get that job done. So, for example, we see a need over 20 years for 478 owner-occupied units under $125,000. This is well below the number of people who need those units, but we assume that very few of those people are actually going to be in the owner-occupied market. So, can we produce that from a new construction point of view? Absolutely not. Not without massive subsidy, but that's what the need would look like. So we're assuming that the relative distribution of incomes that we have now will persist into the 20-year future. The actual absolute number might be different, but the same relationship will exist. And we're assuming that new construction over the next 20 years will be split about 55% owner-occupied, 45% rental-occupied. Right now, we're the opposite of that we're 45% owner, 55% renter, and the actual number of units being built is I think further out of balance. It's even a higher percentage of rental units, but we're exploring. We're still at a stage where we're exploring numbers and kind of making assumptions and suppositions. There'll be a point though that that a lot of people who are in the rental market now, and it's this large millennial cohort that's still largely renting, will eventually begin to evolve to the point where they start buying houses. So whether that happens or not, I don't know. That the idea of home ownership is certainly, with the current generation, from national trends, not all what used to be cracked up to be, but 55-45 is an assumption that we can work with or play with a little bit, but it's something that we might consider to be a realistic look into the future.
Marty, did you say that you're assuming these are new construction units
Yeah.
only in this table?
Yeah,
So just before we get.
or added units, not necessarily new, because they could be adaptive reuse, something that's not there right now, though.
Okay, so given the deficit that we currently have in the range for the 0 to 25,000 population, is it something that we should be keeping in mind that we cannot make up that deficit with new construction, and therefore we have to be managing
Absolutely.
our?
You'll see that. You'll see that
Okay.
you'll see that in a minute too, how we deal with that. So one thing that you'll notice is that the biggest actual unit needs are from an owner-occupied point of view, in the $125,000 to $200,000 range. No surprise. I mean, that is the so-called missing middle that everybody is looking for, and that just doesn't exist. And I would
Sorry,
say
just very
that,
quick second. So
Yeah.
missing middle, if you're not reading planning magazines every month, it's a term that refers originally more to building types.
right,
And that the thought process was it's smaller apartment buildings, townhomes, fourplexes, eightplexes, something that's smaller, things you may have used to see in post-war construction, suburbs that kind of we all moved away from. The other thought process is they're smaller, easier to build, so they might be somewhat more affordable. They're not a guarantee to be affordable, but it's a talking point very commonly in the planning field for the last 5 to 10 years.
yeah, and it's probably not. It's interesting because they're coupled. The affordability and the configuration of the housing is coupled together, but as Kelly said, it isn't necessarily so. So we see a lot of townhome projects that are priced in the $350,000, $400,000, $500,000 range, or even higher nationwide. So the configuration of the house doesn't by itself make it attainable or affordable. And so, it's kind of, it is an interesting thing. The biggest need on the renter occupied side is on the low end. So it's the less than 500, which again is very hard to deliver without subsidy. And even the kind of affordable middle range, which is 500 to 1,000. So we will still go to places where people think that $700 or $800 is just ridiculously high rent. But that's really not the case. And in fact, it's a significant shortage in Ames and again around the country as well. So you have very much the same trends that we see in a lot of other places, but in university communities. And right now we're doing housing work in Lincoln and Bloomington, and they have the very same trajectory.
So how are, and obviously you know where you're going with this, and if you can answer this question later on, you can just go ahead and just defer, but I think everyone understands that the likelihood of being able to build a new single-family detached home for $200,000 or even $225,000 is probably very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So are you thinking, or is part of the factor that the affordable low, the affordable moderate, and maybe some of the moderate market
Are different housing forms.
would be like a condo?
That's right.
Or a small townhome or a non-conventional or something we don't have right now that's very much, and also it assumes that people are going to buy them
Yeah, precisely.
because maybe they don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's exactly where we're
Okay.
going.
All right.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're going to drop down into rent or occupied,
Right.
and they're going to try and find something which is going to be in the low or the affordable, which is then going to flip your numbers, and you're going to go closer to your 45,
Right.
55, or even 40, 60,
Right,
based
right.
on doing some quick math on there.
Right. So, yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
So we're going into sort of a little bit new territory in terms of what we have been traditionally doing in housing markets, and that we have been usually kind of by default assuming that all owner-occupied housing, or the majority of owner-occupied housing, was going to be in single-family detached.
Detached, right.
Yeah. So we would say, well, we're as an example, and we showed you earlier numbers that I'm now going to totally contradict and debunk, that showed that 70% or so of the housing demand would be in single family, and that generated a certain need and a certain density and so forth. And basically, it's the assumption is that all owner-occupied housing would be single family. We're doing a different methodology here and splitting that up into different categories that again are somewhat experimental, and they're based on intuition because there's not so much market information on that, but things that kind of make sense. So think about these as being the kind of gross numbers that reflect if we were to design the optimum world with the optimum allocation of units to people who needed exactly that price range, this is what it would probably look like.
And again, that this chart goes back to the 30% of income.
That's right.
That's behind everything on this
Yeah.
chart, right? Okay.
Yeah, is that matching of that definition of affordability.
So it seems to me that I'm tempted to say that that's more of the numbers at the lower income range, we kind of need to take more seriously than the numbers at the higher income range, simply because it becomes optional. No one's saying you have to spend, at least 30% of your income.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the critical issues are at the lower end of the rental market and at the missing what is just below what the market is producing in the ownership market.
There's a lot of statistics that you can dig into in terms of what the ACS has. And we looked at this a little bit before the meeting too, that Ames on by census data has chosen largely not to overextend themselves in house payments. It's not like we're seeing an average of people paying 4 times their income to be in every house in the
Right.
city. It's actually the census data shows something else, but that also is reflective of the longer you stay in your home, the less, I mean, your payment hopefully stays the same and your income goes up. So your percentage of use of that payment goes down. So that also shows that we have a longer tenure probably for a lot of our homes. People stay in them, buy them down, keep their mortgages at a reasonable level. It just kind of shows that there seems to be financial prudence in the housing market in Ames based on census data.
Yeah. So bottom line is that for a lot of people in Ames, housing is very affordable. For a lot of other people in Ames who don't have access to that, it's not affordable at all. And again, there's nothing unusual about that, but it's just the way it is.
Yep.
Any other questions before we move on? It's really interesting. I mean, just the way the numbers wind up working. So now we say, okay, and Mayor, this gets to the next question, and that is, how do we allocate this to different types of housing, including things that we're not building now? So we've for the sake of argument here allocated housing types to 4 different ranges of units. So low is the typical single family detached unit. They may run as high as 6 units per acre. The kind of typical thing that if we took an average of everything in the city, it'd be about 3 or something, 3 and 3.5, something like that. And if it's urban, it's a little higher. If there's big lot stuff that's mixed up into that, so that brings the number down. Then we come to moderate density, moderate configurations, which generally will range between 4 and 12 units per acre. So here we're talking about smaller lot, single family attached, duplexes, townhomes, that kind of middle density range. That's the next grade up. Medium, or what we could call middle, which runs as low as 8, maybe as high as 24. We're figuring here kind of an operative average of 10 units per acre. So now we're into a townhouse range and low-rise multifamily, like 3-story, 2-story walk-up kind of multifamily. And then the high end, over 16 units per acre, getting into high-density townhomes, and you can generate, I mean, with townhomes, you can get into a 30-unit per acre framework, and all types of multifamily. So think about those as gradients, and like anything else, are oversimplifications of the housing market, but they're a way of thinking about it. So now what we've done is taken those affordability ranges and assigned different percentages to each one of those categories. So as an example, if we look at the affordable moderate, that's the 125 to 200,000 range. Here we're making a supposition that only about 20% of that market can be met by single family stock within that low end, that low range. About half of it is going to be in the moderate small lot single family townhome attached unit, which is significant change because traditionally that category has been single family detached. And then a certain percentage of that will be in even a little bit higher density range above that. And is this based on deep research and market analysis? Absolutely not. It's sort of intuitive, because
So I think my comment would be, this is the question that's challenging the country right
That's
now
right.
on what exactly is a $200,000 house in the country. It is not produced basically anywhere. And will the market move to these higher density things that Marty's talking about? Will Ames people want to do that? Can it be even produced at those prices? So I think RDG is putting forth, like you said, a supposition that this would be one way to look at this. I don't think we could prove to you that this is exactly how it is in the last 5 years in any particular market in the country.
You can't, and it's interesting to me as somebody who lives on what would be called a small lot, single family lot, at the sort of mixed or almost schizoid attitudes that people have. So for example, I know people who are very pro-city, very, very much urbanists, who, as far as their house goes, want to live out with the cows. It's really, it's a very sort of complex set of preferences. Or empty nesters who are aging baby boomers who will sell their house in the city and build a dream house out on a half-acre lot. Or people on the other side who will sell their house on a half-acre lot and move into a downtown district. So the markets are, in terms of personal preferences and what people want at different times of their lives, are really kind of a little bit hard to figure out. But so these are what I think, as somebody who studies housing, are kind of reasonable projections into the future in terms of where we're going. We know that it is almost impossible to build the traditional single-family detached house on 7,000 or 8,000 square foot lot at $125,000 to $200,000 without a massive subsidy. Just can't.
Is it
Can't be done.
assumed that for that affordable low category there, under 125,000, that you couldn't even achieve that through moderate or medium density options? Is
Right.
that why that line is blacked
Yeah.
out?
Well, some of it, we are assuming there that, and again, this is just a way of assuming it, that it is almost, it is impossible to deliver with current technology a housing unit that's not a mobile home in that range. So we are assuming
Even
that,
with the increased density
yeah,
benefit.
even with, yeah.
I get you.
Not impossible, but there's no way that the private market by itself will generate that.
I got you. Okay.
So we're assuming that market is met with existing housing, which means that the people who are occupying those houses are going to be taken care of over 20 years in some other segment of the market. So we've taken, generally the methodology is we've taken that amount
Okay.
out of the new construction phase, and then looked at that, said we're going to do an adjustment, kind of a fudge factor that assumes that the number of units that would be built for that population that we can't do will go off into the other categories. So you'll see what I call the correction factor in the next. So, we can discuss whether these projections, we're kind of looking at general ideas here. We're assuming that most of the over $400,000 market, most of the really high-end market is still going to gravitate towards single-family detached. That's not totally true either, but generally we'll go that way. But that's really less and less an option for the sort of lower middle
Sure.
ends of the income scale.
So Marty, are these figures and percentages being used to allocate land
Mhm.
acres?
Mhm.
So,
You've definitely read this because you're giving me the next slide.
So the next slide's going to be the conclusion to this.
I would
So
look
let's go ahead.
on the basis you can use those numbers that way. I don't think that 20% in your for affordable moderate, to think that we're going to hit 20% in single family detached housing, I think that's totally unrealistic. I think that number shouldn't even be in that column. And I think the moderate market should be decreased. I don't think it's much issue with the last two, the market and high market at 70%. But if that's the way we're using it, I would really suggest maybe reanalyzing those two for our community. I think they're way too, because we're going to allocate too much land to try and accomplish that. So that's the first comment. And the second thing is, to Bronwyn's point, is you said you filter. So let's just say someone sells a house for $125,000.
Yeah.
They're not going to, maybe they will be able to go up to a 250 or 400, but I just wonder, those numbers have to somehow populate.
Well, remember, we're talking about people who aren't there now.
Right,
So-
but they're going to be, well, I guess they could either pass away, move out of the community, go to a different alternative form. But if they're going to move up to a different home,
Yeah.
upscale, so to speak.
Yeah.
You're saying that some of those are going to filter in. So I'm just curious how your model.
Well, what we're doing is allocating that number.
Let's go to
These
the-
are-
go to the
these are
next
not- But
slide.
allocating it up
Okay.
into the next.
Yeah, so let's get to
Yeah.
the
So,
actual
so,
answers.
so now what we're doing here is taking the number, the percentages of incomes, and then attributing that, multiplying that and attributing that to amount of acreage in of different kinds of housing forms. So you'll see, for example, that thing that right here that says distribution factor, that's kind of the fudge factor that's saying, in order to make those units available to the lower income people, that the production in the higher income ranges is going to increase to compensate. So when we make that allocation, we wind up with about 1,000, it's 1,100 or so acres of property. If you'll recall the earlier calculation, it was about 1,500 or 1,600 acres. So there's inherently a correction here for higher density development. And interestingly enough, when we take all of this together, the number of units divided by the number of acres, we get 5.9, which is very much what we drew in all those scenarios. It's almost exactly, so it's a good validation of that what we sort of sketched in blobs actually is pretty close to what is a pretty good picture of what we're looking at.
So in fact, if the 70% or the 20% or the 27% and the 30% in the last slide are to should be slid over, it's actually going to reduce the amount of land necessary because you're going to be getting more.
That's right. It reduces the amount of land necessary. Yeah.
Right. So this would actually be more of a safe number.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why we know that these are not absolutely perfect vetted numbers.
And then at the end of the day, with the decisions on the tiers, there's more than 1,000 acres in tier 1 and tier 2.
Mhm.
So this just is kind of giving you a profile of how we think the housing types need to be. It's not at this point being used to decide how much land area to commit to.
Right.
Mhm.
But it does start to match up, which is good.
Yeah, and when all these numbers seem to be kind of internally consistent and they're making sense with what we've been proposing geographically,
Right.
that's kind of reassuring.
Well, and you start doing all these different color allocations for different densities on your maps, assuming that those are going to grow or contract depending upon what your data is showing.
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a question. So I've lost track of this. Can you remind me of the 10 or 12,000 people that live on campus? Are we assuming that they need housing that's not on campus?
No.
in These figures?
We're assuming that ISU will continue to house roughly 30% of their enrollment
Right.
in university housing.
Okay.
And and the enrollment is viewed as flat
Okay.
for
Yeah,
this
exactly.
estimate.
Okay, good. That makes sense. And
Yeah.
then my second question is, I didn't understand the distribution factor at all. Can you explain that again?
Sure.
please?
Yeah. So if we've got a population that has a demand for, say, 500 units of housing under $125,000, we absolutely can't build. We've got to accommodate that in existing housing stock. But there's still a need for it. You know, I mean, the population still is demanding that need. So we've taken that number and allocated it to all the other categories that we can build. So in other words, if we pulled that out of the new construction, if we pull that out of the new construction, we wind up with something like, 5,500 units if we pull that demand out. And we have a total demand for like 6,400 units. So the correction is basically blowing that 5,500 up to 6,400.
It's to
Oh, so
make room for
to-
people who
to
are
make room
moving
for
out
to
of
make
the
to make room for people.
most affordable housing.
Yeah,
You're
the-
assuming they're going to
yeah.
upgrade.
So we
right?
expand the other categories so that we've
Okay,
got
I see.
room
So
for
it's
the
just a-
people at the lower category.
It's a multiplicative factor then.
That's right.
It's a cushion,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Einstein's cosmological constant. It's a,
Exactly.
it's
I
a,
don't think it is.
it's a fudge factor, no, except his was actually right.
So I think the other part of this for me when we were going through this is I struggle to understand how the 125 to 200 is really still able to be done because you're really depending on people to move out of their homes. The consequence of not building that is it probably pushes more people into the rental market because that's the flexible market that changes every year versus home sales. So we might want 55% ownership housing to be produced over 20 years. That doesn't mean that's going to happen.
That absolutely.
And
right.
that what that's going to do is increase that rental percentage.
Yeah, and the rental percentage is inherently higher density. So when we load, I mean, this is a fairly interactive model, and we can plug in different values and get different results. So there's some level of I've been playing with these numbers all day. Some level of experimentation here, but you got to land somewhere. It's a comprehensive plan, and this is usually a lot deeper than these things usually go into housing economics. Anyway,
So this was all to give you background to kind of start to validate the land use map assumptions
Yeah.
and to give you a sense of a little bit of these next principles that are going to be coming up because we're not trying to get your blessing necessarily that it's 55 or 50%. If something strikes you as way off, then tell us. But otherwise, that's why we're going to keep working on this.
and also they're not necessarily recommendations of policy.
Yeah.
They are a projection of what could happen in the future. And, obviously the markets are going to drive it and all of us are, you do your best to predict the future, but you have no idea what's really going to
And we're
happen.
using the current mix as the future, which again, we talked about this too. If the economic
That's right,
development
yeah.
principles bring higher paying jobs in, then that mix is going to tilt towards the higher end because the new people moving to town will have higher incomes than maybe the current makeup of the town. At the same time, there's still going to be service jobs and other low income people and jobs that are going to be part of our economic growth also. So you can't forget about it all.
When you talk about land needs at 1,100 acres, does that take into account the vacant land within the city limits? That's what it'll need to support that population.
Yeah.
Are you going to subtract off the not in the land use policy plan necessarily, but let's say Rose Prairie, let's say it's 500 acres or 200 acres.
170.
So,
Yeah.
exactly.
We would consider this to be greenfield in or out of the city.
You know,
limits.
it's
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not necessarily,
not necessarily new land.
it's not necessarily new land. Yeah.
Our land has
Yeah.
not been annexed.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We haven't really factored in infill acreage because there
Yep.
really isn't that much. But as far as like greenfield land.
I'm talking about greenfield that's been
Yeah.
annexed and hasn't been
It's
developed.
it's not all annexed, right?
And
No,
what's,
that's just housing. That doesn't include anything for commercial nodes
Or industrial
or
or-
other
yeah.
other factors that council might want to support from a policy standpoint or a vision standpoint.
Right. Exactly.
and
But these were gross acres, right? Or
Gross.
or
Gross for housing, but that would be for roads.
for the dwelling unit computations were gross dwelling units though, right? Weren't they? Or-
Yeah. It's gross. It's gross densities.
Only for residential, doesn't include anything for
No, but it-
commercial.
But
I thought that the gross meant that it actually, the difference between gross and net is that net is about, when you exclude the non-residential.
no, net in residential areas, net would be the land that's contained within the blocks, for example.
Okay.
That wouldn't include the streets.
So it doesn't make room for commercial in addition.
It does not make, no, commercials on top of
Gross
that.
does, but not for
Yeah.
not for
Yeah.
retail.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways. I mean, you could figure gross for the entire city, and that includes every, so when, when we think that Ames is
usually
what, 30 square
People
miles?
per square mile.
Yeah.
So the census will report density on persons per square mile, and that's aggregate,
Aggregate,
everything.
yeah.
That's not helpful for us.
Yeah. Yeah, we're looking at gross of residential areas.
To what extent do these price ranges depend on the cost for land in Ames?
what they don't, I mean, what they're based on, or what the range of housing prices that the buyers can, or renters can afford. And land cost is a factor that can push that number up or push it down depending upon on the level. I would say though that it's interesting because the higher, it's sort of a truism, but the higher the density is, the less a factor raw land cost is. So if you're developing, residential at 8 units per acre and land costs, I don't know, $20,000 an acre, the actual cost of the land per unit is considerably less than if you're trying to do the same thing at 2 units per acre. And that's an important thing, because often people will say, well, we can't build here because land costs are too high. But it's not necessarily as big a factor in the price of a house as one thinks. If it's $2,000 or $3,000 delta, it's not insignificant, but in most cases it's not a deal killer either.
On the other side of that, when you go to very high density, then it's not the land cost necessarily, it's the construction type and all that.
cost,
So
right.
there's two, that's a continuum as usual.
Yeah.
The middle is where the market usually is, and then
Yeah.
the extremes are just not where you see the market.
Yeah. So for example, another factor is that if we're building a 15-story condominium building, the common area costs are going to be really quite expensive. And because there are things like elevators and maintenance and so forth that they have to be factored in. So there's kind of an optimum in there somewhere where you get the benefits of higher density, and then there's a point where the costs can start to generate other things you weren't experiencing before. Okay, so there we have a little sort of experiment in housing economics and needs in the city, and you can when you get into these numbers, you can see where the gaps are and where there are certain things that we're not particularly building that we have a demand for.
And we'll put this back up on our website as the final presentation from tonight, so that everybody has access to the same slide decks that went out on Friday and we're showing tonight.
Margie, to clarify, have there been any realtors or loan officers in Ames who have a long historical knowledge of our market had a chance to review and give feedback on these numbers?
Not yet, no.
And is in your work as a consultant, is that something that's a factor that you normally build into the process?
They were a stakeholder group, and so we talked about it with them. I mean, we talked about these in the background.
So this data, no. General understanding of the market, we had 2 small focus groups, one with real estate people and one with developers to talk about housing construction issues, but not to review these census data and the projections that are coming from the census data.
So to the degree that we're going to be making policy decisions based on these numbers, would it be prudent to have some people who have a solid knowledge of our local economy to review these and give feedback?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would feel
Yeah.
more comfortable just
Yeah.
to have an extra set of eyes of people. We've got people here in Ames that have been involved in development, loan officers, realtors. I would feel more comfortable if we had some extra feedback.
I guess there's not a policy question here, and it's based off of census data, so I'm not sure where to go with what input we're seeking.
I no one's questioning. I mean, just
So what are you looking, I guess, more, what are you looking for? Because I'm not sure what to ask at this point.
We'll tend to find that developers and realtors will actually depend on these numbers, on these kinds of numbers, as much as we will depend on their reaction to it.
So
Yeah.
I guess what are you looking for,
Yeah.
Tim, that they could they could add to the flavor
Sure,
of the
no.
tables.
So is we're thinking about demand, where the demand is, what the price points are, having somebody, I mean, it's valuable to take the census data, but I think there's also another voice. It would seem like it would just be a wise thing to get someone to review
So
these
that was
presumptions.
the input from the focus groups a year ago. Now there wasn't specific data. It was, what are your impressions of Ames? What are your impressions of the market? What do you see as needs going forward? So we did get some sense of that because there was nothing for them to directly react to. I'm not, again, we can reach back out to those two groups and say, please review this, and we want to talk and see if you have different thoughts about it. We can do that. I'm just not sure where it, with how this is done, that's going to be related to what we heard previously.
Yeah, and more, and again, remember that these are not necessarily, I mean, they're policy inputs in terms of saying they're based on our observations and our knowledge. There are certain gaps in what's being produced. But the market ultimately rules. You know, I mean, in other words, let's say that we have, I think, identified a need for moderate density single family housing as an example, and much of the development community does not build that. That's not builders. Home builders tend to like to build $300,000 and $400,000 houses on conventional lots because that's what they know, and they can make a much better profit on that. So we're identifying a gap, and the policy implication is if we think that there's a gap for it, there might be policy that we need to do as a city to open up that market, but there may not be a lot of realtors who say, yeah, you ought to be building houses on 5,000 square foot lots. On the other hand, in some metro areas, and I would put Kansas City in this this range, that the builders and developers are in cities that are trying to build on 38 foot wide lots. On very small lots, and they run into resistance from communities or from neighbors who don't want housing built in their immediate area at that density. This stuff demonstrates that actually is a market that in Ames needs to be satisfied, and the policy perspective is how do we open that opportunity up rather than have somebody say, well, I don't build it, so I don't think there's a market for it.
Yes, I don't beat this into the ground, but we're going to, as we are thinking about issues of density and housing policy, it just seems intuitive to me that we would seek advice, not necessarily on the policy decisions, but just based on making sure that we're working under presumptions that actually are consistent with what realtors are seeing on the ground.
And I think Kelly is saying they did.
Yeah.
So I heard that, but it was the beginning phase. Now we actually have some numbers.
Yeah, and you know, we welcome that. We welcome that input, surely. You know, it's and that's why this stuff is, you know, public.
I think, Tim, what I would say is let's get through the housing principles, because this table really isn't indicative of any policy whatsoever.
That's right.
It's just kind of verifying some different land use calculations. And depending on where we go on policy is probably where the feedback's more warranted. Let's say we pick a policy based off this chart, half of our land's going to be zoned for moderate income or moderate density housing. We're never going to build anything less than 8 units per acre.
Yeah.
That's
That'd
when
be
you
a
need the
problem.
feedback for the people in the market to say, I've never built that. I don't know how you could make me do that and actually reach your goal. Right now, I don't have anything to go to them and say, yep, we have this income level. There's no housing for them. Do you agree? Yes. That's kind of where I'm at with not sure what they would provide for input until we get direction on where the emphasis is for the city and the comp plan about land use mix and housing priorities.
Okay.
Yeah. Or if we were showing, no market or no permission for conventional single family, for example, that would be something that I suspect that home builders and realtors would really react negatively to and say you're totally off base. So we're not doing that because we would have been totally off base to say that.
So I think what I took away from this is, which is what I would have said before we did any data analysis, we want housing of all levels. We want market moderate, we want below market moderate, and we want high-end housing because we can prove there's probably a market segment for all four of those.
Exactly.
And that would be what I recall from the real estate input. There definitely is an absence of new construction at a lower price point. No one's going to argue that. That's the feedback I recall from the real estate, the realtor small group, is when people come to town, they struggle to find a place. There's not a lot of choice. Price is a factor, but it's the competing interest about what am I getting here versus there, what's available today. And it's clearly at all four major categories.
And the policy implication then is, and you know, this is what we would hear from builders. Yeah, we appreciate there's a market. We can't afford to build it. We can't deliver that product because land is too expensive, infrastructure is too expensive, construction's too expensive. People want, and this often comes, people want the house that their parents were in, but you know, we can't build 2,000 square feet and put it on the market for $150,000. And they're right, you can't do that. So, you know, I mean, these, you know, we're not making decisions on like whether a number is 516 or 456, or it's demonstrable that unless we're totally off base, there's a market for a variety of different types of housing. But that said, we really do want people to react to this, and you know, as we develop the ideas further and you know, add their experience to it.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly, can you remind us what the typical lot sizes are in the older neighborhoods versus newer neighborhoods? I'm thinking it's sort of 6,000 to 7,000 in the older neighborhoods maybe, and then larger than that.
So older neighborhoods as defined as literally Old Town.
Well,
I mean, that's what's older, I guess, is
yeah,
a little bit harder.
I'm thinking
to,
the core neighborhoods.
So Oak Riverside and Old Town and those areas. I would say it's definitely sub 8,000 square feet, whether it's, I don't think it's an average of 6, but definitely sub 8.
Okay, and now what is a standard lot size?
I mean, when you're building you're saying so in a FSRL zoning district for
Yeah.
single family home, you're talking typically 8 to 11,000 square feet.
Yeah.
Okay, and do we have a typical lot frontage that could be associated with these? I'm just trying to gain the.
So that's all, the lot frontage is always a factor on garage size. So
Yeah.
you need a certain width to have a 3-car garage versus a 2-car garage versus a rear loaded home. So we don't really produce very many rear loaded homes.
Mhm.
So lots are definitely driven by that frontage to be able to get to the 3-car garage or the 2-car garage. So we went through that exercise, if you're with us 2 years ago, about the text amendment on garage size.
Mhm.
We kind of went through what's the difference of the different effect on lot needs and lot sizes depending on you access the garage. So that's a big driver for the lot size is the 3-car garage desire. And I don't remember what the statistic was, but it was well over the majority of new homes have a 3-car garage, especially at the price point that we're seeing. A new home sale is over $400,000.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that, just because the 3 garage doors together are typically 60 feet, that,
No.
what, three garage
The
doors?
width of the would be 10, 10, and 10.
10,
So-
10, and 10, yeah.
And then the lot would
Well,
be typically
No, I'm
closer
sorry,
to
yeah,
7.
30, yeah, you're
That's a
right.
big
The
garage.
60, I was thinking about 20, I don't know what I was, yeah, we sort of went on vacation there for a minute. No, because I'm thinking 3 2-car garage, thinking about a garage unit being 20 feet. That, yeah, 30, yeah, 3-car garage, 30 feet, then another, so that generates about an 80-foot lot.
So I think if I can close the loop on the outreach or feedback, I'd be more comfortable getting to more of a
What's your
complete
lot look like?
description of what our housing policy and intent is for public comment than just to review the projection data. And if that's all right with council, that's kind of how I view this as coming together as more of a complete package so you can see it all together, if that's satisfactory.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're going to get to the principles. Marty's going to go through all 4 of these slides and and these are the same 4 slides you got in your packet. So what we need to pull out of you is some of the bullet points don't go together. And we need to understand where the push-pull factors are on these policies. And that'll help influence how different land use classifications get written, maybe individual policies, how they get written. Kind of the 2 things that Marty said are kind of the core issues we need direction on are what's going to be regulated or required versus incented or accommodated, maybe. Kind of just big picture issues there. How far do you go towards an idea? And then I forgot the second one, Marty. I gotta look.
The other one was, requirement versus incentives and zoning and land use. So the other thing is it to what degree does the regulatory framework change that allows things like higher densities, mixed uses, mixed development within specific neighborhoods or residential areas?
Both existing and new. So those are the 2 kind of overarching questions that kind of hover above all 4 of these principal slides that you've seen. So this is where you guys are gonna have to do most of the talking, and we need to get the feedback on these 4 slides.
Yeah, so we're going to try to set things up here a little bit. So we're not going to go through all these bullet points, but they're meant to be issues or discussion points rather than recommendations right now. They're ways of solving problems, but they're up there really more as directions than as specific programs. So principle number 1, which is certainly consistent with the survey results and pretty much what everybody has been telling us, is expand housing choice and attainability, which is the new word for affordability for people of all income ranges. So, we know well that we're not necessarily doing that in the new development market, that we have people of all income ranges, and the new growth is really tends to be in a certain segment of the market, namely kind of university-driven multifamily and home buyer driven lower density single family development. We're not building a whole lot in the middle. So the overarching questions are really what Kelly described, and that one of these sort of dichotomies being, do you require things within the city's legislation, or do you create incentives such as some level of risk participation or infrastructure development or some other kind of issue that's paired with people providing some of the products that we need. So let me give you an example. Minneapolis has just adopted a set of requirements that mandate what they refer to as IZ or inclusionary zoning. So the Minneapolis model is really kind of a combination of what are sometimes referred to as exactions and incentives. So it's the Minneapolis, and I may be interpreting this poorly, Minneapolis for renter occupancy, for renter occupied projects over a certain size, say that you've got a choice of either providing a certain percentage of units that are initially rented to people within of below 60% of the adjusted median income or the annual median income, different numbers, different requirements, or making a cash payment in lieu of doing that so that the city can then go out and get that job done or subsidize it with another project, or build a compensatory number of units on a different site within the area of the project that you're building in so that, again, they can't all be clustered in one place, or donating land that the city deems acceptable for the development of housing. So they give a developer, and they've got similar kind of requirements for owner-occupied projects of a certain size as well. There's also in in Minneapolis a program that they call the 4D incentive, and 4D is actually a section in Minnesota tax code that for quote affordable development projects assesses the first 40% of value differently from at a lower rate than everything else. And so it's an incentive to build mixed housing or an affordable development. So that falls in the category of requirements. So that's what you have to do there, and it's rather new. And there are other cities that are looking at that kind of thing, versus an incentive structure such as saying, if you build a subdivision and a certain number of lots meet our or houses meet our standards for affordability, then we will participate to X% in the construction of the municipal public improvements, the infrastructure to support that, thereby in a way, offering not a mandate, but a break or help in helping to compensate for what a developer might see as being lost revenue.
So I'm going to give a quick time check. We're an hour in, and we're just to the 4 discussion slides. So just to give a time check, just to make sure we're all where we're at.
In other words, don't talk so.
That means we need the council to start talking. Yeah.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that you guys are encouraged to talk here on the next 4
Yeah.
slides, and probably ask more questions than us explain it at this
The-
point.
So then the other side of the fence is regulatory, is land use regulatory, and that is saying, do we restructure zoning categories in a way that you're permitted to do accessory dwelling units or a certain amount of use or density mixing within what might in the past have been exclusively single-family development, which is another direction that places are going in. So there's some communities that are eliminating exclusive single-family zones and saying that you can have multiple structures on one lot, as an example of that.
It strikes me that if you have an incentive, so I like the thought of, just incentivizing rather than regulating, but if, say you have the example of where, if you have a certain percentage of your units meet our criteria for affordability, we'll chip in a certain amount to the municipal infrastructure, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're basically, that's a straight up subsidy anyway, because you're going to have to pay exactly as much as they view the revenue loss in terms to get in order to get them to want to
Mhm.
take that deal. So I don't see how that, how that gets used, I suppose that's how we subsidize, right? Is through that.
Yeah, but they're also getting, but it's not just the so-called inclusionary units who are benefiting from that
Sure,
infrastructure.
that's true.
Yeah.
Marty, are you familiar with any communities in Iowa that are using things like inclusionary zoning? When you go through this, my first response is there's no way the legislature is going to let this fly. We went through a very long tour of duty on a rental housing cap, and where it was presented that we were being very heavy-handed with respect to land use. And I'm having difficulty imagining that in this legislative environment.
That could very well be.
Are you familiar with any communities in Iowa
Yeah.
that are doing some of these
No.
things? I just want to be mindful of Minneapolis has housing pressures that we can't imagine, and they have a regulatory climate that's quite different than ours. So I just want to be realistic about rabbit trails that we pursue if we can't.
Yeah,
Realistic.
and also it's
That's-
interesting to note what Minneapolis refers to as affordable housing for a family of 4, $1,700 a month. Or something like that some number like that for rental housing. So, it is in fact a very different market. And as unaffordable as we think Ames might be, it's a lot worse. So, yeah, so there, you're right that there's a very good likelihood that would produce feedback or pushback in the legislature or in this legislature. I don't know the political situation, which would suggest, but you would encounter a lot less problem using an incentive structure rather
I
than a
agree.
mandatory structure.
Iowa City has an inclusionary zoning ordinance for one area of development. I think that's in the report that we got from Planning and Housing, and I knew about that from before it was requested. So I don't know what's happened with that in the last couple of years, but
Yeah, and I suspect, do you know which neighborhood it?
I'm thinking it's River something. And
Yeah,
I don't
it's-
know Iowa City well. so
And it's probably in exchange for an incentive.
I,
I'm pretty sure it is.
I
Or
think
for the
it
use
is.
of TIF or something.
yes.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask about requirements versus incentives, because in talking to the council member from St. Louis Park, Minnesota, she was talking about how successful their requirements have been with regard to inclusionary practices, because they've been willing to also put TIF into the mix. So they do have requirements, but then there's
Yeah.
also the understanding that if we really want to encourage this.
Right, and they actually call that like lost income abatement or something like that. You're right. There's a structured program that in a way it compensates, quote unquote, the developer or builder for a level of lost income by making more affordable housing. Our own preference, just in terms of the politics of situations, and also it's a lot easier or a lot nicer to make friends than enemies, is to go the incentive route rather than the mandatory route. But it's a choice that needs to be put,
And incentives
Out there.
can be direct financial, but it can also be changing regulations that make it easier
yeah.
to do what you want to see done.
Yeah, it's interesting. In some cases, the incentive is you take away something that you then give back. So for example, Austin, Texas had what they consider to be a very effective incentive program. What that was, well, we'll put you to the head of the line, so it'll only take 3 months to process your subdivision instead of a year. So, or something like that. So, it's sort of, it's a very significant incentive, but generally, many of our developers would expect much faster processing anyway. So that would not be a good thing to slow down everybody else.
We do often hear about the difference between the way Ames requires developers to come up with the funding for the infrastructure compared to other growth
Right.
areas in Iowa. So this would seem like sort of a natural starting point, even though, as you point out, it's still, you're still assessing the cost is more or less the same way, but the starting conditions are different. And I think that changes things somewhat.
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah, and we sometimes will think about this as risk abatement too, that a builder, there's this sort of interesting flip in housing markets where the level of reward and the level of risk are flipped. So if you're a builder and you build one custom house, get a 15% profit margin of it and know who the buyer is, versus building $150,000 houses speculatively and you don't know who the buyer is, and your risk is greater and your reward is less. It's an interesting aspect of housing markets that tends to discourage building affordable housing. So incentives can reduce that private risk, and it's another way to approach the problem. So then the second issue becomes, the second principle deals with the conservation of neighborhoods. And so maintain the quality of existing neighborhoods while also encouraging reinvestment and enhancement of existing housing stock. So this gets into areas of how do we encourage people to maintain and recycle existing housing that really is our best reservoir of affordable units, How do we maintain their quality, prevent deterioration? How do we deal with the opportunities for infill development in ways that have minimum impact on the existing neighborhood around it, and that whole sort of panoply that deals with how do we conserve neighborhoods, reuse housing stock, prevent things that we don't want to see, like maybe an irresponsible investor buying 1 million houses and renting them at high rates to whoever. So this is there are a variety of neighborhood conservation strategies to think about, but here the issue is largely one of do you say that our policy becomes much more one of leave things alone and maintain those, or are there opportunities for increasing the density and the yield of those of existing neighborhoods?
And this is one that this type of a principle is not addressed well in the current land use policy plan. It basically locked down everything that wasn't new and said no change for a variety of reasons, but it didn't really talk about anything else, whether good or bad, about these areas. So we're trying to pry out of you a little more thought about the existing parts of the city, not just focus on those expansion areas. And some of the council's comments have indicated interest in existing areas for different things, and that's what we need to get more direction on.
I mean, my thoughts on that are accessory dwelling units, conversions, ways that you can slip more people subtly into a neighborhood without raising the neighborhood and rebuilding, right? So, but those are a slower, change if, waiting for people to maybe convert their garage to a rental unit if, say, they don't use their garage currently. Like, that's a way you could slip more people into a neighborhood and keep it pretty much the same. I mean, you're increasing density, but it's better than tearing it all down and increasing density that way.
You know what I'm going to say.
I do. And that's why I said that in that tone of voice.
So my concern is that these sound like great ideas, and they can be really good ideas, but they're problematic in college towns.
I know.
Because you can never be sure that the affordable housing units are actually going for reaching the people who maybe need the most, the families that are living under the poverty level.
I hear
And
you.
that's an enormous challenge that requires some creative thought in terms of how we deal with it.
You're not going to like the next thing I say either, but it's the one roomer clause. Like, again, using just my own personal experience, there's 3 of us that live in that house, and financially, I would not have been able to buy it when I did without having that. And we're not trashing the yard. In fact, we're nice to the property. But I hear you. Like, how do you do that in a way? How do you allow it in a way that doesn't just allow an influx that's unstable?
The problem is that
but it must be.
You always
doable.
have to be, from my perspective, you always have to be considering the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario, which is you've got great neighbors and everybody gets along. And I'm afraid and I'm not saying this is not directed at students. I mean, you can have horrible neighbors who are not students, right? And I have concerns with our vacation rental ordinance. People are buying up homes for vacation rentals, and then you can put in an accessory dwelling unit. You suddenly make it very attractive for opportunistic buyers from elsewhere who may come in and actually buy up the below $125,000 housing stock that we have. So whatever we do, I can't go into it saying, wow, that's a great idea.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying
a good idea,
these are all going to be hard
cautionary.
conversations, I think, about how we increase density, because it's either you do it subtly by, trying to slip as many people into those existing neighborhoods as you can, or the neighborhoods get rebuilt into something denser over time,
But of course, we can't do that because we can't meet the affordable needs.
Right. I mean, that's the worst case
raising
scenario.
our
It's not that,
Kelly, to what granularity do you need tonight from council? Because, for example, if at a higher level you said to try and increase density, the council's open to that, then the staff and RDG come back with some suggestions how you might accomplish that, or you're looking at going down to suggestions on ADU or whatever, to what level of detail that will help us kind of tailor our conversation. Otherwise, we could get down some different paths for a long period
So you don't
of
need to
time.
decide. I think it's at the high level. Are you willing to consider ADU regulations or not? Not what would those regulations
Right.
be and what circumstances would we, that's a whole
Right.
separate
Yeah, yeah.
project. I think the key ones are exactly what Bronwyn and Gloria were talking about. What's the comfort level about how far do you go
Exactly.
in existing areas?
Yeah.
I mean, the new areas are on the table too, but if that's not a controversy, that we have more options and more flexibility in new growth areas, that's fine. We can write those tools. It's the infill questions that we need the most direction on.
Maybe there's places where it's appropriate and not. Like, I'm not suggesting we go into scan and we recommend to them removing the one roomer clause, right? But maybe there are places in town where it's less of a risk, right, than that neighborhood, like something like
Well,
that.
and I am not averse to exploring these things. I just don't want us saying what's good in this neighborhood is good in all neighborhoods. Because I think that judging by what I've seen from other college towns around the country and what I've heard, this is a problem. And I don't know, you said
Yeah,
you're working in Lincoln and
absol-
Bloomington now, Marty, and I know.
There was an enormous argument in Bloomington over a new unified development ordinance. And the original idea was to say that on any residential lot, you could have 3 dwelling units. That they were eliminating they weren't eliminating single family housing, but they were eliminating exclusive single family zoning. The neighborhoods around Indiana University freaked and said, you know, my little, what are you telling me? My little lot can have 3 units on it, and so we had a series of stakeholder group meetings at the beginning of the housing plan process there, and that's all they talked about was the UDO and this requirement. And ultimately what happened was saying a compromise by which you could do ADUs and any higher density on a single lot required special use permit. So basically it's like mini rezonings, yeah, an extra step. So yeah, it's a one idea that we were, you know, it says limit higher density infill development to specific types of street frontages. One idea, there's the interesting problem of some houses in older neighborhoods reaching the end of their useful life, that they're either too small or too deteriorated, and somebody buys them and decides to try to get something else done at a higher density with that lot. And that's part of the life of a neighborhood. So one idea that may or may not make sense is to say, well, we go to the complete streets plan and say that you could do that along the streets along the street frontages that are designated as mixed use avenues or as boulevards or thoroughfares, but not on local streets, so that you're sort of relating traffic and traffic row to at least an opportunity for higher development density.
So one thing that's kind of inherent, if you kind of looked at this as a whole package about this one issue, because you could say all of these could be accomplished.
Yeah.
Essentially, maybe not on every property. What's one thing that's inherent in this is how far do you go to put protection measures in about the design components, the parking components, rather than just say it's okay and it's anything that can get thrown up in someone's backyard.
Yeah.
Or what can I do to I mean, these are conversations we had in the concentration cap. What happens to the change to the front facade because someone's enclosing a porch to add the 5th bedroom? Those things, if you saw in general, this was okay, but you have a lot of things you need to follow up on what are really the standards. I think we would emphasize you have to bring the design components with it. Otherwise,
No
it will
question.
fail,
Yeah.
absolutely. And we don't have those in the zoning ordinance now,
Yeah.
except for a little bit in SEPCOD, and that's it.
Yeah.
Everywhere else, you can do whatever you want to the look of the front of your house or any part of your house, really, as long as it meets setbacks. So if the question is, how do you put it in comfortably? It's a question of space, it's a question of parking, but it's also a question of what effect on the look and character of that block or that house do we as the
Although-
city want to mandate?
My sense is that we've all expressed interest in emphasizing infill, and I think those go hand in hand, like you're saying, that it's irresponsible to just say infill without taking up those issues as well. So that would be my preference if we're doing a straw poll, then we have to do both. We have to figure it out.
So that's kind of a good summary on these issues. If we kind of get that kind of direction, then we know what package has to get
Which
written
direction we want to go.
to address kind of the influences. Now, if there isn't a consensus that we want to see that package presented, then that's what we also want to know. So if the question, I'll simplify, David, I think kind of just captured it all for us. Simplistically, we're okay with this principle. We think there's a lot of pieces that have to come together for it to work over the next 20 years. Then we can run with that and put together kind of what those things need to be. And they're going to be follow-up implementation measures because your current codes don't do it.
Sure.
And that's where you'll get into the nitty-gritty of what's okay, where maybe it's okay and not okay. The kind of the where, there's citywide, and then there's what Marty said, their emphasis on certain street types. That's an option. And then that last bullet, that's kind of one of those equity questions at a different level. Is not every neighborhood is already at a density that we're talking about. Can they still keep going higher, and is that fair? Or is it those other neighborhoods that are at 3 units per acre and we want to push them to 3.5 by allowing for other things to happen? Those are the kinds of things that are pretty big policy statements. And you're going to, if you want to look at that, we'll put that together as a principle for the housing components. And it affects Marty's land use classifications. If we get to that, there's some assumptions in there about certain types of neighborhoods having more flexibility and others not. And that's something that that input will feed into that kind of classification system.
So Marty, one clarification point, if you will. I'm a little confused. When we went through discussion of infill, you showed us areas of the community where we would be able to achieve the
Yes.
desired increase in population. And I didn't realize that you were approaching existing neighborhoods as being subject to major changes in order to achieve our
No.
goals. So if that's correct, then could you explain why are we spending time on thinking about existing neighborhoods if we have other infill options?
Because first of all, now from my point of view, the principle of neighborhood conservation is a critical one. That and it relates a lot more. We're not going to build thousands of units by stuffing them into existing neighborhoods. We are going to preserve housing stock, our affordable housing stock, by conserving those neighborhoods so that those buildings are there for the future. But nevertheless, it's important to be able to identify policy, because there will, I think, inevitably be situations where over the next 20 years, where houses deteriorate, where they don't meet the market, and so forth and so on, and there begin to be projects or proposals that ultimately change those land uses. And so having a policy and a policy perspective that addresses those areas and build up neighborhoods is important, because we're trying to make sure that things don't happen by chance.
I think that's really fair. Old Town is a really good example where the character of Old Town has changed a lot because there was a sudden influx of putting in higher density apartment buildings, and that's really changed the character of Old Town. Now, maybe at this point people say we're okay with that, but boy, there was a lot of pushback when that was happening. The situation in Minneapolis, I think, is really a fairly radical approach, because when people buy properties, they have an anticipation of what the character of that neighborhood will be. Now, we can't promise that forever, but if we do something from a policy perspective to encourage that change, I don't have enough political courage to do that.
I feel like I've been talking about accessory dwelling units this whole time, right? And this whole time, I meant in existing neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
So,
appreciate that.
Allowing those as a policy decision. I mean, so that has been on this table the whole time.
Yeah, so
So it hasn't been on the table. It's been mentioned in passing in a variety of circumstances. That's why we're talking about it
Sure.
tonight.
Yeah.
So
that-
I tend to be in favor of maintaining existing neighborhoods while we're working on the presumption that there are opportunities for infill in other
Oh,
areas.
yeah.
And with our growth. So if we can achieve the 15,000, if that's what we're shooting for, let's explore those avenues before we would make significant changes in existing neighborhoods. It may be, Bronwyn, that we can look at some of these suggestions on accessory dwellings and maybe some rumor things along the way. But as far as our core tools, I just don't think we gain enough population that way.
I mean, it's a very slow change. I would agree to that. It's not going to get us the houses we need in the time we need if we were to just do that.
Right.
But I think that is a big piece of how we get the range of affordable, that 200,000 in existing neighborhoods, how we get any more of it there now,
I don't know that it's saleable though.
No,
If
that's
you're-
true. I mean, that would just add to the value of the property it's within.
I think you're creating a rental unit.
Market. Yeah, that's true.
That doesn't exist is
Yeah.
what you're doing.
I mean,
And-
Marty, this is sort of your area. I mean, I think of Washington DC, where the housing markets are off the chart. And so people are shoved into closets and basements
Right.
and all kinds of places. And somehow it works. And allows people to buy housing because they are willing to forego parts of their houses for other rumors and things. But I question whether we're there yet in terms of a market that is really feeling the pressure to do that.
Yeah, definitely not. I would draw some parallels though to some of the things that have been happening in Omaha. And I think Des Moines as well. And that is in older neighborhoods, a developer, including credible developers, will go in and buy 3 or 4 fairly dilapidated houses, demolish them and build a townhouse project. And in a lot of cases, that will be seen as being fine. But when the projects get I've been working with a neighbor largely on a pro bono basis that's encountering this, and they're not against density. They think that there are certain, and this is kind of the direction of the neighborhood plan, is that there are areas where you can, like a commercial node, where you can support higher density, but you can't support it in the middle of the neighborhood. And their problem is exacerbated by the fact that a little private university went out of business and closed up and sold its campus to the Omaha Public School System and to a couple of developers. And there's real concern in terms of the scale of what they build on these sites. So having
Sounds very familiar to me.
yeah, it's very familiar. Yeah. So having a policy that in a way defines where density is acceptable and where it isn't acceptable. For example, in an existing neighborhood that's
Well,
experiencing pressure
Old Town's already
is
pretty
important.
dense, right? Compared to like existing neighborhoods on, say, North Ames, right?
It
It's
is.
a lot less
Absolutely.
dense
Oh,
up there.
no question.
Yeah.
So
no
when we
question
say
about it.
existing neighborhoods, I think, looking at SCAN and what we would do there versus what we would do, in some of the outer lying neighborhoods is probably different, right? There's not much more.
I'm just wondering how much our previous many, many months of developing our university near campus neighborhoods plays into this. I mean, is there room for us to be looking at near campus neighborhoods as one kind of category? Because we spent so long talking about
Just wait.
balance. So anyway, I think as someone who lives across the street from an entire block, other than one home, that is all conversions, single family homes when my husband was growing up, now there are triplexes duplexes, and not one of them has a family in it, right? So we aren't really meeting that family affordable component. We're
Correct.
meeting the student affordable
That's right,
component.
right.
I think, although they're more affordable than the new high rises, but I don't know how much those houses cost. So for all I know, they aren't affordable either because.
And the numbers weren't divvied up like that. You know, it's households, not like families versus students in terms of the numbers we saw for need.
No, I know. That's what I'm saying. Student affordability and family affordability are two things. But when we look at who is getting most of the affordable units in Ames, typically students are getting more of them than families are in the near campus neighborhoods. So there is a difference in the population distribution. And so with conversions and ADUs, you could probably expect that those would be handled differently in near campus
Right.
neighborhoods than in the
Yes.
north of
Yes,
20th
exactly.
or wherever.
I really have some grave concerns about, yes, I want to affirm you have been talking about ADUs, Bronwyn. I don't disagree at all. But I don't think if we don't have a design component,
Oh, I totally think we should, yeah.
first of all, and secondly, you talk about property rights, and if I have a larger lot and I put in an ADU, how's that going to affect the person next to me who may not have an ADU? And you could have chaos starting to develop in our neighborhoods because people are popping things up because all of a sudden your rear yard setback or your rear yard requirements are all of a sudden waived in order to accomplish a specific objective. I think it's going to increase staff time in terms of doing review. You're going to have very strict criteria. And it just seems that, as you're saying, Tim, when someone moves into a neighborhood, they have a certain expectation, so to speak, of what it's going to look like or the character. It's just to go into this one, man, I think the devil is going to be in the details. And if to really understand it, I think I need to know what the staff implications and are. If you go to a special use permit, ZBA and other groups are going to have to go through and evaluate and have judgment calls. And you got people,
I really hope we don't do special use permits. I would advocate not to do special use permits.
Marty said you could do.
No, that's
We could. I mean, when we get to that is a whole different world. If it's that questionable that it needs a special use permit,
That would be,
my advice is that's probably not the right policy.
yeah.
It would seem to try and really strengthen and maintain the existing neighborhoods, encouraging reinvestment in home ownership. Because we do have an issue with the rentals, and look for other opportunities for infill, as Tim was talking about. But there is value in those existing neighborhoods in terms of aesthetics and the way things are laid out and in property values. And I'm just concerned you start doing ADUs and other things. That's going to attract people who are going to be doing not owner occupied, but they're going to be landlords probably investing in that. And it's not as easy to convert a garage into a living unit when you try and meet bathroom requirements, plumbing requirements, exhaust, power requirements. So that's not going to be inexpensive undertaking.
I wouldn't say it's going to be cheap housing just to do it necessarily, like you pointed out, or to build a standalone unit. The other thing that I'm not sure you can or can't do in Iowa is whether many cities require it to be owner occupied in one of the two units.
And I was just going
That's exactly right.
That may or may not be legal in Iowa.
We just lost that battle. I would argue that the Realtors Association would absolutely come down, and legislature in the current state would say it's a property rights issue. You cannot mandate that.
I would say it's an open question. I have not talked to legal about that because we have no direction of what to look at there. So that might be one reason why it's harder to do here than other places that
That's
are
true.
doing it.
That's true.
'Cause-
Regionally. Yeah.
So what I'm perceiving is that, there are a lot of thorny issues here that we have to sort out, but what staff needs to hear from us is like, are we looking at this and saying it's too complicated, let's not do it at all? Or do we want staff to look into this?
Well, and
know,
you could well say that the number of units that are going to get generated by ADUs are not worth the trouble.
Right, but we, sitting here at this
say that.
dais, we don't have those numbers. I'm not comfortable making that call. So that's why I'm advocating for actually investigating this a bit further, rather than sort of overloading us right now with possible pitfalls.
Yeah,
We're
so I
already
think,
doing that, aren't we?
well,
Didn't we
I think,
discuss
so we can probably close this one up. If there's a simple majority, 3-2, to say at least put a package together, doesn't mean you're committed in 2022 to implementing it. I mean, this is a 20-year plan. It might not be the first priority to
Yeah.
implement.
Sure.
Yeah.
But if it's not something you can understand going forward with and investigating, then don't put it as an implementation measure. Don't put it in the plan right now. Do it as an amendment 5 years from now or something else.
So I'm a little awkward, we don't have Amber with us tonight.
It's true.
So this is an important juncture. I mean, I want to keep the conversation open to give her an opportunity to have input.
I
Yeah.
thought Bronwyn's motion,
Shouldn't move anything, yeah.
no, a while back,
Oh.
when she asked staff to look into,
You asked
Wasn't
us to estimate
Give
if
us-
it was allowable, how many do we think
Yeah.
could be built? So we haven't had a chance to talk about that and give you an idea if it's 5 or 15 or 26.
but even having that information, which was a decision of the entire council, moves us a little bit closer to deciding whether it's worth pursuing this.
It's also something I'm not confident in whatever answer we give you,
Yeah, okay.
that it's predictable.
Thank you for your
It's
honesty.
just the only way I can see to, other than, getting several properties in a row and taking them down and putting them down. It's the only way to, what would be the word? Remediate the old lot size standard, the large lot size standard. And again, it's not all neighborhoods
Mhm.
some are dense enough that you wouldn't want to squeeze in additional units. I just think there are currently existing neighborhoods in the city where that would be, those would be absorbable. But again,
So short of going through a motion, can you just summarize what you think you've heard? And let's get basically a idea from council of
I would
yes, for
feel
support.
on this slide, the main red principle everybody's on board with. It's what are the programs that support that concept? And we want to, what I'm trying to say is we want to proactively acknowledge in the next plan that our neighborhoods need support and that there's going to be changes that kind of happen. Now, the specific question on the ADUs is whether we're going to put a package together about a policy to consider and support conversions or accessory units in existing single-family areas, subject to a whole separate task, separate standards, and there's design implications that go along with it. That would be what I would say is kind of the discussion at the table right now. There's no commitment that that's going to work for everybody, but that's kind of all I need to know is if that's what you want to see as a package like that, so you can see it again in a draft plan where you have all of it put together. That's what we need to know tonight. And this is going to come back to those land use classifications. If we get there tonight, Marty, what's the name? Existing traditional neighborhood.
Traditional neighborhood.
Its description talks about how this might be an area where accessory units or some conversions might be palatable.
Yeah, but I think it's important also to say that for that to work, the lot size in a specific area has to be proper. So the
And we can pull,
separations between buildings and so forth all need to be.
and if we're not committed to it, because it says follow-up implementation issue, we'll pull that out of the land use description. I mean, that's why it's a draft tonight for you to see. We'll pull it out of the one saying this is an area where ADUs might happen. Well, we wouldn't put that in the description until we went through the whole evaluation process and made sure that that was true. So right now it's reflective of that idea, but we don't have direction to include that. That's what we need to get to.
So is everyone, what is council's thoughts? Does everyone agree with that general direction?
Can I get a little clarification first? So the various categories of neighborhoods which show up on slides later, there's a difference in the way ADUs permitted is stated, and I'm trying to understand that. So in traditional neighborhoods and established neighborhoods, maintenance of single-family characteristic on residential blocks, ADUs permitted with adequate site area. All right, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But then when we get to emerging neighborhoods or middle residential neighborhoods, actually emerging neighborhoods, ADUs permitted on new lots with adequate site area, not existing lots, but new lots. Is that because there is no such thing as an existing lot in an emerging neighborhood?
That
Or
would not,
why-
that would not be true.
I
That
didn't
would
think
not be
so.
true.
So,
Yeah.
so if you
So-
think Northridge Heights is in the area that's labeled as
As emerging,
emerging
right,
neighborhoods,
yeah.
as well as the rest of the North Growth area. So
Yeah.
there are
Mostly north of
homes.
24th Street.
Okay, and then university neighborhoods, ADUs permitted on new lots with adequate site area.
You're
I-
ever going
I-
to have a new university neighborhood?
Well, no, I'm just trying to get my mind around why you could put an ADU in neighborhoods as long as you've got the size, but we're going to restrict ADUs in the other neighborhoods to new lots. So
To the general character of the existing sites in the quote emerging neighborhoods is lower density than in the traditional neighborhoods.
yes,
So I mean, so we're, how this all gets packaged and discussed out, we're, at this point, we don't really know. These are, and that was really much more written from the perspective of the character and the existing density that we're finding in different parts of the city.
I'll think a softball out. Are we okay though contemplating future zoning allowing for accessory units in our growth areas? So it's a product
That's
type.
it,
It's an
yeah.
option that can be built in
In the
upfront.
growth areas? Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, that's the softball, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll just remind that we took this up during goal setting. We haven't voted on the goals, but we actually, in goal setting, we value diverse housing options, and we mentioned zoning, minimum lot area, multiple dwelling units on a lot, and accessory dwelling units. We didn't say exactly where, but this is something that we've.
Well, that's just the point, though, is that it's where it's going to be located and what's the impact going to
Sure,
be on
of
it.
course, and
Oh,
we
yeah.
need to understand that.
All right, so just to give Kelly is everyone in support of what Kelly summarized under this point? And if not, please speak up. We're gonna move on to the next point. Assume that everyone's in agreement with it. Okay.
I just had one last question. I'll be quick. What about the worst case scenario, the fear that a property owner will buy a property, let the house dilapidate, or several in a row, in order to then come and be like, well, they're already in crappy shape anyway. Why don't you let me do this thing I want to do? How do cities protect against? Is there a way to protect against that sort of practice? Or
Well, I would argue that if you have the policy in your comprehensive plan about where you want to see change happen, it's easy to respond to that. If you don't want change to happen there, then property neglect is not a reason to do anything.
Right.
That's a violation of some property code, not
code,
a reason to tear it down and rebuild. So if you're okay with change happening, that's what the plan's here for.
we
Just
don't
to
really
say
have
that you
standards
are.
of neglect, I guess.
But if someone's trying to change a zoning district to
Sure.
get something more,
Right.
then you have a policy that says, yes, we're willing to consider that in this area because we think it's beneficial regardless of housing condition.
Sure.
Housing condition should not be a reason to get a jail out of free card and
Yeah,
build
exactly.
something
It wouldn't
different.
just be housing, you might get the pushback, how about just someone tearing down a perfectly good affordable house to reposition two units? That's where you'll get some feedback. So you're thinking deteriorating, I'm not thinking deteriorating, I'm just saying, but I guess you're saying the benefit outweighs losing the one affordable house because you seem to be putting up two, right? You're getting higher density in two, that's the trade-off. I'm not sure that's be acceptable by the neighbors, but that would likely occur. That doesn't stop you from tearing down a house.
I've seen it actually go the other way. I've seen neighborhoods where you've got two lower quality houses be torn down and a nicer, bigger one on two lots. So there we reduce our density there by putting in one house where there were two.
Can
You know,
you
I
reduce the stock.
just mean, yeah, in terms of protecting the stock that you have, is there a way to disincentivize?
I mean, unless you have a property maintenance code that's beyond a rental code,
Right.
there's no, I mean,
yeah.
zoning by itself is not going to change that. That's a housing policy. That's a community investment policy
Or
that you
historic
want.
district designation or
Yeah.
some other.
I mean, you can do a neighborhood conservation overlay where you have design standards, but that doesn't necessarily mean upkeep standards.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it is odd that there are a number of situations around the country where smaller houses that really are in the scale of a neighborhood have been torn down and replaced by a McMansion. And that produces, some people could argue that's an upgrading, and others would say it's really deteriorating
That's the one thing I think we've somehow avoided in the last 6 years
Yeah.
with our housing boom is you have not seen that really
have not
happen.
seen that,
Yeah.
right.
You've seen a few rental properties augment their capacity, but in general, you haven't seen a lot of wholesale change go that way.
All right, so we cover this one adequately to your point?
I think if you want us to move forward with essentially what you see here, yes, then we've got it covered.
So did we give direction to staff on the first one?
We didn't because we were going to go through all four, but we haven't done it that way.
We deviated already from our policy. All right.
Yeah.
So we'll come back and pick that one up later.
Okay, so this is looking at the emerging or the emerging neighborhoods or the development areas, and suggesting that, number one, that we recognize a couple of things and want to think about promoting a couple of things. One is intentionally mixing housing in growth areas and how we go about doing that. So the first question is, do we want to avoid the kind of monoculture of the traditional subdivision? An interesting question is that is the village issue that and our theory, and Kelly and I were talking about this afternoon, is that the village idea in the LUPP was well intentioned, but it's micromanaged. And when we think about villages, or a village idea, there's sort of a broader perspective on that, namely that there is in a village a center or a node of some sort that might involve mixed uses or higher density housing, but that is sort of a characteristic of the village. That there's good connectedness, the streets link, walkability is well established. There are network criteria in terms of the street system, but in terms of trying to tell people what kind of awnings they have to have and what the dimensions of their building need to be, not so much. In other words, the concept of the mixed use kind of diverse walkable neighborhood is a very good one, but we can kill that concept by trying to design it in words. So we've got a couple of areas, or at least one area that we're saying makes sense as a village, but we're envisioning there is very different from a much more deterministic idea of a village.
So this one is really trying to reinforce those growth areas that you want us on the land use map to kind of depict how you saw the scenarios get developed,
Yeah.
that there is a predictability and some level of intentionality behind it. The old plan left it vague and said,
right.
Village zoning will make it work fine. We don't think that was one tool. We don't think that's exactly the right tool. I think we've clearly seen that in 20 years that wasn't how it worked in the market. Now there are trade-offs. If you look at Prairie Trail and Ankeny, it's at a different scale than Somerset. It's extremely prescriptive. Everything there is because the city said it had to be that way, but a developer wanted to do it. So they followed through on that over the years. So I don't want to take these ideas out of the whole toolbox. We just need to make sure that we can have that plus others that still get us to that intentional arrangement of uses and street layouts and designs that reach all those other ideas about land use and goals we have for density and efficiency and transportation access and green space in a predictable way. That's really what we're trying to get to and make sure that's okay.
And we have no big assemblage of public space, of public property like Prairie Trails.
Right.
I mean, it's good. So what I mean, I think ideally what we would like to see is some of the broad concepts of that that can make a village a good, the quote, village idea, a good thing, and make that usable to the private market as opposed to, requiring some sort of a special heroic measure. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it, but that's it's
And
just
the other
do it because it makes sense and not because you're being told to.
So the other one that's kind of on that, so most of it's about kind of zoning or land use designations up front, but the next to last bullet about linking incentives, we haven't talked, we're not using the nomenclature of incentivized growth or non-incentivized growth. Maybe we picked the lands called tier 1 and tier 2, and we're going to plan for them. Mm-hmm. You're going to need policies about what an oversizing of a street is. What does that mean? Is there something that you're going to ask for as part of that? So that bullet's something we're not telling you tonight, but I guess generally, are you okay that we start to work on a policy about when city participation and what parameters that would work under? So the current LUPP has a few pages about it. It's not super committal, but it talks about what it expects to see in certain geographies rather than certain uses. It does talk about village, but it's undefined after that. We think that based on our understanding of where we're going as a city, we probably need a little different set of parameters than how it's currently worded. And you're never, this always comes up, well, you say we're going to give incentives. Well, you're still control the power of the purse. It's your budget. It's your capital improvements plan. No one can obligate you to spend money you're not comfortable to spend it on. But at the same time, if you want to reach the goals of the plan, you have an area you want to grow in. We laid out high costs for some of these things. The South Growth Area will need city participation. Does that mean it's an initiative by the city, or is that in partner with somebody else? Those are questions that'll get answered over time as you move into the new areas. But we need to have some idea that you still want to have policies and parameters related to new growth for both intentional layouts, some things you want to see there, and then participation or other things that would help facilitate those growth areas.
So option 1 would be someone purchases property and city zones it for a certain use, or right now it comes in, it's
ag.
And then they just go ahead and petition for it. And let's just take the South Growth, for example. They come back and they just want to do a housing subdivision. And the next person wants to do a housing subdivision. And the next one wants to do the same thing. And all of a sudden, we don't have any focused small commercial node type because the market or the developers prefer to do the housing just for sake. It's not whether it's right or wrong. It's just
Quite a good concern.
So,
Yeah.
whereas the other option would be is that council would set some by either density or building type. I'm trying to understand, but what I've seen in Marty's sketches so far is he's kind of showing just kind of maybe some small commercial nodes, and he's got some different densities around some of those areas. I guess I was assuming that's kind of the way we're going, but that's the heart of the question right here.
That's the one thing we need confirmed, because that is not how the current land use plan is drawn.
Right.
So that would be a departure from the flexibility of doing villages, which wasn't viewed as flexible, to have more of a predictable outcome that, hey, this is where the two streets come together. This is the one that needs to be that mixed use avenue so we can complete the streets policy the way we need for networking. And that's going to be the best place for commercial.
Right.
The South is probably the easiest one to visualize because it was a
Right.
neat little package that kind of fit in the tier 1 areas that you told us to go into. The West is a little different because there's a lot more moving parts
But now
out there.
we'll go through another iteration
Yep.
of that too.
Yeah,
So
but the South is the easiest one to talk
So
about.
if I bought 160 acres, and in our plan it showed 20 acres was really to be I'm making these numbers up, to commercial, and I came in and said I want that to be all residential, the answer would be no.
Yeah.
yeah,
That basically
Because there's a reason
20 acres need to be dedicated to commercial. That's what we want. That's our vision for the community and growth development. So
Maybe
there's some controlling going on. Is that correct?
or I would say some other way in which a center or some sort of fabric could be established. So I would say and that to come in with 160 acres of just undifferentiated subdivision would not be what we would want to see.
I think you would struggle, again, if you go back to the first discussion about what's the mix of housing type, if you don't have these different gradations of density, you're not getting different housing,
Yeah.
regardless even the price point. Let's say it's all $350,000. It's still different housing types that meet different interests. So I think if you kind of start to stack these interests up, we've reached the conclusion the best answer is to start with an expectation. Now, is it literally 20 acres, or it's enough acreage to accomplish a commercial element that we want? That's probably the flexibility. Maybe 15 is good enough, but we have a red area that says here's the street that we want to invest in as, again, a street type that's in the complete streets plan. That means we need buildings that are up at the street. We expect commercial office, retail, mixed use housing, whatever else around it. All of it has to stack together to be intentional. And that's
so how's
not
the
how we operate.
transportation network determined then? Does that become
Yeah.
your complete streets, and who decides that then?
We
Okay, at
do.
what point?
So in Marty's land use map, you'll see we have the overlay of the complete streets. So you start to get a sense of the character of the roads, which leads to why the land use designations are what they are.
Yeah,
So we
and
combine it.
And that's where the marriage of the complete streets plan and a land use and development plan is really critical, because it's really the streets that help to determine where those things want to be.
So I'm struggling a little bit to understand why we would think that mandating a certain, let's say, certain acreage around the intersection is going to be commercial. Why is that going to work better in this plan or the South Growth area or wherever than it has when we've said we want mixed use, and you can have apartments upstairs, but your first floor has to be commercial space? We've got a whole bunch of commercial space around town that is unoccupied because we said you have to build your housing with commercial space.
And that sort of orthodox, basically, that vertical mixed use generates more commercial space than you can ever fill. So the idea is really, I mean, our idea is really much more you can build a center in a variety, a node, a sort of thickening of the urban fabric in a lot of different ways. I mean, I've seen projects where I'm thinking about this great little development around Longmont, Colorado, that was kind of modern new urbanism, and it takes one storefront. And that's a place. I mean, that if it's a coffee shop or something, that it doesn't have to be, 20 acres of commercial or an attempt at doing vertical mixed use, or it's created something that, and they're not, you can do it with a public space, with a little bit higher density housing, with a child development center, any number of, but having something that is, being able to have something that's flexible but isn't just necessarily a monoculture, the same thing over and over again, is kind of what we're looking at.
I think the difference is this: what we're saying is there's not one way to build a commercial node.
That's right.
We're saying commercial is important here, which is a little bit different. Obviously, we have a lot of different zoning districts to do commercial, but the old plan was really focused on the village being the way commercial is going to be, and then we added other stuff later. The other part is that, and I lost my train of thought there, that again, I really did lose my train of thought.
Derailed.
Housing.
So you said, why would it be more successful? Oh, the other component of this is we are taking the long-term view. I mean, the South Growth area is not something that's only 200 acres of land. It's a much larger area. It's 5,000 people. So you have to plan for those eventual needs.
Right. Yeah.
And we wanted, I mean, the intent was to have reality behind those assumptions. I mean, there's some calculations, and I know this was done previously with the last plan, but we want, if we think commercial is important, that's what's going to be important, not necessarily the architectural style. Now, the street network is still critical because we're going to build a street system that supports the way we want transportation to work in the city. And there's going to be certain building types that work better with that than others. But we're going to say, here's your working environment. These are the street types you have to live with. We want commercial, or we want at least this much commercial. Mixed use may or may not be required. Marty definitely does not advocate mandatory mixed use. It's definitely spread all over the place because it's hard to fill. I think it's just a little bit different approach. And it does require a long view that it is necessary in this area over the long term. I think it's just a little bit different set of tools to get where we want to be. There's, again, it needs to have some flexibility in where that actual boundary is, but it can't be just one thing. The monoculture is not the goal. So having policies say that monoculture is not the goal gives you some range of how you would deal with where that line actually gets drawn and when.
So I look at these bullets, bullet 1, bullet 3, which starts with focus, and bullet 4 are statements. Does council agree with those bullets? We'll go back to the second bullet and the fourth and the last bullet. So it's plan for an intentional mix, focus on the most desirable, additionally link infrastructure. Does everyone agree that those are good to include in the policy? I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding yes.
Is the last bullet similar to our earlier discussion
The last bullet
about,
being which one?
additionally, link infrastructure? Is that issue related to the question of incentives or requirements to try and create a more inclusive?
Kelly, can you?
It may or may not be. I think that's yet to be determined. On this slide, it was more about, are we setting up the framework of the development area to be the way we want it? Is it where the collector street is that we need to have for the bike lanes and the shared use paths? All of those things that's kind of linked with, again, we're getting the housing we want, so therefore we're participating in those other infrastructure. The second level would be, is there more emphasis on a particular housing type or affordability level? That's probably a little bit different, related but different question. It wasn't inherent in this slide necessarily.
So I thought that's what I was getting out of zoning incentives to provision of attainable housing, established thresholds for eligibility. So is that not
But
about
higher,
that?
it can be. I'm saying it can be either. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. But the other one, higher intensity zoning, is a very common thing to say. You get to start here. You want this. Well, we're expecting something through a contract rezoning process that addresses multiple needs. Like, so in all of the RH rezonings we did from 2013 to 18, we didn't ask for very much. We were pressured to produce housing because of the growing population. Very little was asked of those projects because of the pressure. If there's more of a policy about, we can consider this, we'll upzone things over time, or even fill in the plan where we want it to be. Well, what goes into that? There's economic value there. Are we making sure we're getting public benefit out of the economic value? So there's incentives, there's realizing value back from giving value, and then there's asking for something the market's not going to produce at all, which would be the low income housing components. So it's all kind of there. And obviously it'd have to be a multi-tiered policy if that's where we're headed.
So is there general consensus on bullet 1, 3, and 4? All right, so bullet 5, I would just say it's just, or it's saying.
That was informational. It wasn't a set
so it's-
policy.
right. And bullet 2, can you just kind of help us restate? I mean,
So I think that wasn't necessarily a policy. It was a question to throw out there. Just talking in density. Our old plan spent a lot of time talking about density and then relying on village to be the design solution. I think RDG is advocating for a little more context to density about what the expectations are for buildings and character, not just, well, 8 units per acre, perfect, that's all we expected. So it's more about the townhome. It's more about the mid-rise apartment building. It's more about a mixed-use building where that's necessary rather than just density.
Okay.
And if that's the kind of the general approach, then that's what that bullet's trying to get to. And if that's endorsed by this, that kind of builds into that design community character components of the plan, and that would get reinforced.
But you're not saying that the design of particular pieces of land would specify these have to be townhomes or
No.
these have to be anything else. You're just saying those
I
are
don't-
the toolbox.
I don't think so, because it'll be a broad band of a color swatch. Let's say it is that medium, let's say it's the middle density category, that 6 unit per acre. Well, there's only so many product types that can accomplish that. I don't think you say, well, this block had to be townhome instead of small lot. That's not really where we're headed.
Just as long as there's still some flexibility in there.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, and it's also, we think of those areas as being average density. So so you could have a rational mix like Somerset is of single family and townhouses and multifamily and achieve an average density. And that's a very good project. And
That's so cool.
It seemed to me that this is going to potentially could give some certainty to developers. They know, hey, this is kind of where the city wants to go. It's in general nature, not being prescriptive, not designing the
That's
buildings for them. They know, hey, if I come in with a project that wants to do this, this, and this is kind of shown in their comprehensive plan, there should be some more open arms. I mean, what it's going to look like and all the devil in the details, that's what staff takes care of. Would that be an accurate statement then?
I hope so. I also think it helps you have more context to the request when somebody wants to change something.
Yeah.
Because on our maps, we show you, it shows nothing. So it's easy to say, well, there's nothing there, so I can offer something now.
Yeah.
And it might still be valuable to get now and not later. But at least you go, well, here's what we were thinking. How
Right.
does this request fit? There's just very little context for amendments in the current plan. And I think that's one thing that we've heard in the input of this whole process is we want the plan's not flexible, that it has no meaning, but that we're able to accommodate change as it comes up over the next 20 years.
So is this implying that we may want to establish form-based zoning in some of the newer growth areas?
I don't think it goes that far.
Okay,
That's a later conversation.
just
If
checking.
you want to talk about staff time, we'll talk about
Yeah.
that.
Okay, so is everyone in agreement with what Kelly just described in terms of that kind of a concept, in terms of not just straight density, but it's given some more direction? Okay, next one.
okay, this one's probably easy. So this goes into identifying what we've called redirection areas. Those are the sites that we've discussed in the last couple of months that are sites where we can achieve a different type of urban place or different type of density through redevelopment or through re-envisioning areas that are pretty highly underutilized right now. And these all will typically require more specific plans or concept plans. In a way, the Lincoln Way plan is an example of that.
I think this addresses Bronwyn's question. So I think this
Yeah.
one's pretty simplistic.
This is pretty
That
simple.
we're going to have a map that says these are areas that we're
That-
okay
that we're
with
looking at.
entertaining changes. Maybe we don't rezone it day one, but this is where we want to see
Yeah, we
rezonings
want to see
happen.
changes and
I feel like this is right in the middle of where we've been talking about infill for the last 6 months.
And that would also take into account the Lincoln Way corridor study plan as well. too?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so ultimately you'll get a map that kind of has these outlined areas where you would expect it. So the Lincoln Way corridor plan will get folded into that with those different focus areas and plus some of the other ones. So in December, we showed you a couple of other ones. There's
Right.
a lot of
Yeah.
range on what things could be, but
Illustrations of what
at
it-
least.
Understood. It was just,
Yeah.
it was an
Yeah.
initial concept.
So for example, some of those were near Campus Town. Some of them were east on Lincoln Way. We looked at area near Oak Riverside. There's just a couple of different areas that we looked at. And there could be more as we start to put the maps together and you start to go, hey, what about this? More could be added or removed.
Everyone agree with that? All right, so we need to go back to the 3 slides then, right? We didn't get.
Yeah, the first one, you didn't say anything, so it must have been
Oh.
perfect.
There weren't any questions. Yeah, exactly.
oh, that one.
We didn't ask.
It all
Yeah, no,
looks-
no, we talked about that.
It all
pretty
looks good.
extensively.
No,
Yeah,
I
I
didn't.
did
No, we didn't give any direct. I don't think staff's got direction on this yet. Do you? You didn't. We didn't give any head
Yeah.
nodding on this one.
You didn't say you love it or hate it. That's right.
So can you summarize what's the core issues that you're looking for, like from council on this particular one?
I think this one's kind of a grab bag for a lot of different ideas. Not all of them are zoning related. Some of them are like the next to last one
Our
is
community
kind of where we
development
come
related.
from with our CDBG funds, right?
Yeah.
We have a perspective of using our CDBG funds, not just for infrastructure, but other kinds of community investments. Thinking through those ideas, thinking through community investment, not just through a zoning lens is kind of what this slide is looking at different times. I think I've heard, yes, we're endorsing a full range of housing types in new growth areas. We're going to ask for multiple housing, not monocultures. On the next slide, you said, hey, we'll see a package about infill maybe some gentle changes in different places. We want to see it before we commit to it. That's kind of built into this
Yeah,
also.
some sort of willingness to consider or to scale.
Like the third bullet, you don't need to revisit the third bullet because the next slide, you just talked for 20 minutes on that one.
Mhm.
I'd say if there's a bullet on here that jumps off at you, then let's address that. Otherwise, I think it's kind of baked into the conversation so far.
Well, I think that one of them is your fourth bullet, inclusive housing opportunities and requirements within new development. That is a big philosophical piece. Secondly, I think a question is to what level is council, from a policy standpoint, willing to contribute funds or participate in development, which is potentially contrary to what we're doing right now. That's a big,
Those are big.
and I think that's embedded in this overall, conversation. And to what level do our taxpayers contribute to achieving attainability of housing for people of all income ranges? I mean, those are big policy issues where you're actually taking and using taxpayer dollars in one situation. And I think I heard from, Tim regarding the 321 state, some of these, underwriting, I'm missing the term, but basically the contributions that are being made was getting close to $90,000 a house. And so the point is, I'm not saying that would get to that level, but the point is that those are, to me, what I think I think what's embedded in this. If I'm wrong, please let me know, because then we can take that off the table, Kelly. But I think that's part of it, because that's what kind of the Minneapolis model is. And I will say this too. I think at National League of Cities, I went to a seminar about inclusionary zoning, and boy, there are some very unfavorable reports back on some of that too. And so I think that's what the fourth bullet, inclusive housing opportunities and requirements.
So there's a range to that. So you could look at that through two different lenses. One could be literally through the affordability level. What's the household income? That's what we basically talked about. The other inclusive component is, what are the building types? What are the building sizes, where you don't force it to necessarily be at a low income household level, but you have variation in housing size. So you have different market level price points.
But that's requiring the developer. We're basically becoming prescriptive to the developer and what they can build to hit certain targets, though. Because
the second one is not exactly
What's
that.
that?
No, the second one is maybe saying 10% of your units or 10% of your lots need to be under 8,000 square
Right.
feet. Something that gives the builder the flexibility to build the house they know they can sell, but you're not just getting all quarter acre lots in a row.
Right.
But that also says you can build bigger houses too. I mean, the idea is we just don't want one of the same thing over and over again. Or I shouldn't say that we want that. That's the question that's on the table.
Yeah, and I would also.
And you're not making the zoning decisions tonight. It's just whether that's a policy that is worth diving into a little bit further, and how does that affect things? Because you've already said you want the land use plan to show a variety of housing types. The question then is more of a zoning question. What's the
Right. I'd also make the point that housing configuration or design and affordability may or may not be related to each other.
That's absolutely true.
In other words, it's funny because right now a lot of the direction of advocates for inclusionary housing are really directed towards zoning laws, and my suspicion is that you could change zoning laws significantly and not really have an effect on affordable housing. Not because housing affordability and production and cost is really more a matter of money than it is zoning. There are places that exclude multifamily, and that's clearly exclusionary, and it's clearly, given cases like Laurel, illegal. But simply allowing higher density housing or townhouses or whatever doesn't produce affordable housing. It produces housing diversity. It promotes choice.
So on this slide, there's a softer version of this,
Yeah.
which says in general we're comfortable with these ideas. We want to pursue them, investigate them. And then there's a little bit firmer version that says we will require new development to do such and such.
Yeah, right.
So that's that continuum question. If
Yeah.
in general you're more in the middle or the softer side, that's how the policies get shaped. If they're just not necessary, we won't write them. I would think some of these are necessary to express the expectations again of the city. Whether it's mandated as another level of a question.
Okay, so council, give some feedback to Kelly then.
So I would say, when I look at the slide, I don't see it saying that this compels us to adopt inclusionary zoning guidelines, right? So, otherwise, I think, yes, we do want to promote, encourage, and support different housing types using whatever tools that we have that are appropriate. We'd also see if we're fortunate enough to continue to have CDBG funds in the decades going forward and that sort of thing, then that might be an appropriate way in order to create some housing that fits into the mesh of those sort of neighborhoods. These seem like reasonable things to keep in mind to me.
I would say one other thing that we included in here that I think is an important decision is to say that designating redirection or redevelopment areas goes beyond drawing a box on a map, and it implies at some point some public participation in making that happen, in making those areas happen.
What would that look like?
Well,
So think like downtown Gateway, right? So that would be a redirection area. We don't have a specific ask, but the thought process
Gotcha.
is some element of TIF is necessary.
Yeah,
But
so
it might
that's-
also be
yeah.
something better that we're investing up front in rebuilding that street so
Right.
the developer doesn't have that frontage improvement
Right.
instead. I mean, there's different ways to tackle it, but that's what Marty's saying is somewhere there might be a city intervention one way or the other.
Yeah, it isn't just saying, okay, developers, we'd like you to do this because we drew it on a map. There'll be some involvement of some sort in that.
Marty, I have a question, and I'm nervous about the scope of the answer, but let me try and I'm sensitive time. We're focused on Ames housing development, okay? When we talk about attainability for people of all income ranges, there may well be people who would say, I can afford Slater, I can't afford Ames. And so to what degree are we going to develop policy to try to compete with the housing market of Slater, Sheldall, and so on? So I want to be careful we're not in a silo, in a vacuum here. We have surrounding communities that have quite a bit of housing stock at a much lower price
Right.
point.
As Vanessa would tell you, the first Story County housing plan that we did, we're about to start another one, but the first one was based on that the towns in Story County around Ames would actually become much of the affordable housing stock for Ames. That because their prices were so much lower. So, the issue there was, Vanessa would show me neighborhoods in West Ames that involved CDBG funds, I think, or some form of public participation to keep housing affordable, and on the second resale is no longer affordable. So I would, as a bit of a regionalist, would say that we're not necessarily going to be in direct competition with smaller towns in the county, and that they can provide and should provide housing opportunities as well. There's no way they can provide them at the scale that, or with the services that Ames can, but there are people who prefer, just like there are people who prefer a smaller town lifestyle, who want to or need to live in surrounding communities, and that's perfectly good. And that in fact, Story County's housing policy should include Ames, and Ames is a member of the county, and there are regional connections as well.
I think this is important to keep in mind. The amount of potential subsidy to try to get price points down to a point where we're competing with a Sheldall or a Slater, I think that's going to be a really heavy lift for our community. But I do think that we should be keeping into account the Eastern Industrial area, we're going to be adding a lot of jobs that are more blue collar in that industrial area. And so to the degree possible, I would love to see us be able to provide housing for that. And I worry a little bit that the chicken and egg thing is going to be the case, that if we don't provide housing, then that's going to further, we're already getting feedback on this, that it's impacting our ability to attract employers if we don't have the housing. So it's a chicken and egg point.
Tim, I would say that in thinking about this, I'm starting to focus more on what do we need to do to ensure that the affordable housing that we already have in Ames does not go away. Because if we have to meet a large portion of that under $125,000 housing with existing homes, we have to be really conscious of the policies that we implement that could do away with some of those properties. So increasing density, incentivizing redevelopment, making it attractive for people to come in and buy smaller homes and then tear them down. I mean, I was looking at Oak to Riverside earlier tonight, just as a sample, looking at South Hazel. There are several houses on South Hazel that are under $120,000 assessed value. Now, I know assessed value is not what you can get for the house on the market, but how many places in Ames do we have a neighborhood where you can find multiple homes that are under that $125,000 mark? And yet that's a very attractive neighborhood, maybe for redevelopment. If we look at one of Marty's maps where there's this big brown spot over that area that says high density, if I'm reading the color correctly. So I am trying to be conscious of not doing away with what we've already got, and then thinking regionally as well.
Yeah, I apologize. Maybe I misspoke. I'm not suggesting, I wasn't speaking at all towards our existing housing stock. My question is, how hard are we willing to work as a community?
How deep are you willing to
Yeah,
subsidize? Yeah, right.
because
No, I know your
321
question
state
was about
was a
subsidies.
heavy lift in terms of trying to figure out how far are we willing to go on this? And that's just for a small area. That's not a very big area. It wouldn't be that many units.
I think it's the one thing I worry about, and we talk about the surrounding communities being housing for Ames, so to speak, is those are often also the people who have the least reliable transportation. So we're putting poor people in a very tenuous circumstance to tell them to go live 20 miles away, because if their car breaks down, they're screwed, right?
But we're always telling them that.
No, if we tried, I mean, that's the upside for trying to find housing for them in Ames, right? Is that they could.
Disagree.
Oh.
In an ideal world with an unlimited budget, we could make all kinds of things happen. But realistically, we might look at things like, doing something different with SciRide, finding other ways to create transportation. Sure. My preference would be to keep them in Ames from the standpoint of the schools and the taxes and all kinds of things. And I want to be careful when we talk about for people of all income ranges. I think that's tough.
I think my take on this would be a little bit different. I think you shouldn't approach the next 20 years presuming that the affordable housing stock is outside of Ames. I don't think that we're saying Marty's been very clear, we're not saying we can produce 900 homes or whatever the number was at 125,000. It's that we want to support a diverse housing market in the city. We want policies that do that, whether it's retaining or constructing, but we're not going to neglect it. We're not going to leave it off the table. It's not a mandate to go produce it. That's a totally different issue. That's going to be a budget issue. That is not a policy. I mean, the policy is that we want to support it. How far you go, what it costs, that's a budget issue. That's not something that's directed out of the comp plan. So that's my takeaway, is that we want to accommodate a large variety of different things at different price points, not presume somebody else is going to shoulder the burden.
It's also consistent with the survey results as well, too, that there are a lot of people were in one of the earlier slides in the PowerPoint that, or at least what we got sent to us or downloaded, it did demonstrate that there was a support for a broad cross section and a wide mix. So, Rachel, any thoughts?
Thanks for answering my question.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that we've been talking a lot about how we want diverse housing types, and just because it might be difficult coming up with the money or finding a creative way to do it doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate it further and put the effort into looking into it.
So I'm wondering, since we've been talking about incentives and subsidies, what does it really mean to assist with redevelopment and land assembly in the third to the last bullet? Because that to me sounds a little bit like somehow we're going to be, I don't know, buying properties and then reselling them to developers, which I guess is kind of what we're doing with maybe with 6th Street with the properties that we got there. But I don't know how to.
I would
to
say
read
we
that.
don't do this now.
Okay.
So this is here specifically for emphasis on infill.
Oh.
It's very
Well,
difficult to
okay,
do.
but let me raise a hypothetical, and it's hypothetical that I've confronted in several projects in my other life as a community development director, and that is you have a developer, and the developer has gone 95% of the way toward assembling a site. And there are 2 or 3 owners of slum properties who are now the holdouts and who are threatening to basically torpedo the whole thing. What do you do? There's no clear answer because people. I mean, this is a situation that will often come up in redevelopment projects. Because people are highly adverse to eminent domain for private redevelopment. But on the other hand, they're also highly adverse to somebody who is not contributing to the city, preventing the city from, or preventing somebody else from investing in it. So what we're saying here is that it's conceivable that could come up. Is that going to be in your toolbox or not? We're not saying it's going to happen in any one situation or that you would even do it, but it's that's what that could mean. Just or it says developer says I can assemble this property, but I need some assistance in coming up with the purchase price of it. It's things like it's.
So that would be,
it's
so
things like that.
my experience, that's kind of an affordable housing thing where
Mm-hmm.
we've, not in this jurisdiction, but other jurisdictions, we'd see an affordable housing entity come forward and say, give me a pre-development loan. I can do the design and I can get a loan to acquire this property. Well, that's helping with land assembly. It might not be private market. It might be an affordable housing developer because they don't have necessarily upfront funds. So that's that last example, something I've experienced from literally affordable housing developers needing that upfront assistance to get to the project site. We were just talking about maybe the larger market versions. Again, this isn't something we really do. So it's kind of hard to give you examples how it would work in Ames or exactly. I mean, we can't necessarily just go use eminent domain for private benefit either. That's not really a choice in Iowa. So it's more of, again, statement of intent goes a long ways. When you're asking staff to do things, is it consistent with policy or not? Staff works within policy. So if you have adopted policy that these are things we'd work on, it kind of fits into a work plan. It kind of fits into the budget. It kind of fits into how we are going to approach projects and development over the next 20 years.
So does council, do you generally supportive of those bullets then? Short of the last two being under other discussion. I mean, it's the ones. And then I guess the other question I want to ask, if I see everyone's heads nodding, so they think that staff's got direction on that. Kelly, do you need, and Marty, do you need an answer around requirements versus incentives? I mean,
I think we've got.
I think we got a sense.
We've got a good
It's a
sense,
balance.
yeah.
It's not an overly regulatory environment that
Yeah.
you're headed towards.
Yeah.
At this, that's not what I'm hearing. That's the bulk of the conversation here tonight. I don't
Okay.
know how far incentives go, but I hear regulations are not necessarily the only answer.
Yeah, and we totally agree with that. For us,
It'll probably happen as soon as we do it.
okay.
So I think this this was a big lift. I think this is one that we've wanted to get through. I think some of these are things you've brought up for a while now. Is there any other housing question that did not make one of these slides that's been burning in your mind to ask Marty or myself or Corey?
All right, do we have the energy to plow into the next part?
Yeah,
Just a map, right?
I think, yeah, let's see if we can you go through it and see if we
Yeah,
can,
I
I mean,
think
let's,
so.
let's do it. Let's do a hard stop at 9 o'clock.
So
Let's see if we can go ahead and.
So can we just jump to the map and talk about the map rather than the tables?
Sure.
And then we
Yeah.
can go from there if there's
Yeah, the
questions.
tables can.
Yeah, so let's just talk about the two maps
Because
and see
the
where it
critical
goes.
path is we'd like to map it.
Yeah,
So there are a couple of, just a couple of quick things that we have made or are suggesting some additions to the complete streets plan. So there are a couple of categories in the maps that are streets, examples, Clark Street, or Clark Avenue rather, that's a bikeway. It's a significant street in the city. It's not in the complete streets plan, and we think it probably should be. There are a few streets like 16th maybe or 9th. Those are examples of that. There also are a few streets that we suggest be extended to help make some of the development areas grow better. We want to connect the complete streets plan with the land use plans. That we've talked about that correspondence already. So now we get into the map categories, and this gets a little bit different. We have for years and years characterized land use maps with basically kind of souped up zoning or more generalized zoning maps. So residential, commercial, industrial, so forth and so on. And we have found that that's not satisfying. It tends to lead to a lot of map amendments or a lot of plan amendments. It's very hard to predict the future on that kind of lot by lot or granular scale. And so we've moved toward kind of a different sort of zoning or land use categorization that's much more policy oriented and to some degree intensity related as well. We also have been working in other peer communities. So Fayetteville, Arkansas just went through a comp plan, an in-house comp plan that they approved earlier in the year. Bloomington in 2018. They're not a client of ours, but Champaign in 2011, and they're moving in the same. Their plans are really in the same direction. So what we're suggesting is more of a neighborhood concept of traditional, established, and emerging. Traditional being effectively most of the city south of 13th Street with a little excursion into 16th Street. Smaller lots, somewhat mixed density, historic grid character, those kinds of features. Established neighborhoods, if we look at the north side, are generally the areas from 13th to 24th, post-World War II development, somewhat bigger lot sizes, more of a kind of uniformly single, not entirely so, but single family character. And then emerging neighborhoods, which are the new development areas, generally north of 24th Street. And these each have individual characters and characters that we can build policies around. They're primarily residential, but we want to provide under certain circumstances, certain locations, opportunities for use mixing and define what those might be in their areas. Then we've added a few others. Middle neighborhoods are the primarily apartment districts or multifamily districts and we've got a number of those. They're probably more prevalent on the west side around the university but there are a few in other parts as well that are primarily multifamily or townhouse or whatever in character. We call them middle neighborhoods after the middle housing category. Village neighborhoods are Somerset and one other whose property designation I keep forgetting, but Kelly knows it. The one south of the
The Fort Myers. So on the example map, it's labeled
Yeah.
for Fort Myers.
Yeah, and the university neighborhood, which is obviously the area that is within the influence of ISU. So that's one set of generally residential environments, but having some opportunity for use mixing that define their specific characters. The centers are primarily, but not exclusively commercial, and again, they're kind of character districts. So major mixed use would be North Grand, as an example, or even potentially South Duff. Community mixed use are not that we have that many of them, but this would fall into the category of High V, for example. That's a community commercial project that could also develop some higher density housing around it. Neighborhood mixed use, an example of that would be a node like Bloomfield and Stang, or Bloomington, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's a Bloomfield in Bloomington. So that's Bloomington and Stang, where there's a convenience store and it's kind of neighborhood scale. Downtown, obviously, the village center obviously would be one like Somerset that may or may not be commercial, but is that kind of node or nucleus we're talking about. And then finally, Campus Town, which in a sense is a village center, a more specific type of that. Special development areas designated in the land use map would be the urban corridors like Lincoln Way, the redirection areas that we've talked about, the areas that would go through redevelopment, major civic areas being large public facilities. Employment would be major industrial employment, major like the East Side industrial area, office and research oriented, and then what I call, for lack of a better term, gritty urban. I don't think that would show up although maybe it does. So gritty urban is like East Lincoln Way, where it's not a big employment center. It's largely kind of industrial and
Soft
trade,
industrial.
soft industrial, yeah. But things that people maybe wish didn't exist, but they do, and we need to they're part of life. And then finally, rural would be development reserve, that are the areas that we have identified in basically tiers 3 and 4, and then even other areas where urban services are feasible, but where we're not planning to go. And then finally, agricultural beyond that. So that
I think
those could collapse a little bit, but they're but in looking at the distribution of land uses initially, those are things that describe the various contexts that we have in the city, we think.
So go to the map on the next.
Kelly, are we going to reclassify existing areas within the existing city, or is this only for growth?
No, it's for the whole city. So I'm gonna bring that up right now.
So it'd be a redrawing
So-
of the land use,
so I-
map.
Map.
If
Not
we-
a zoning map, but
So if we go to the map,
that's complete streets.
Yes.
And then build on that is the land use.
This is current?
no. So
Oh, that's not- okay.
let me talk to this for a little bit so I can get to the direction I think I want
You want to go in, right?
There's only a little bit of time, so there's a little bit that we need to get to. So one thing that's good about this quadrant of the city is it has a little bit of a sample of almost everything that
Right.
Marty talked about. But if you look north of Bloomington, that's kind of re-envisioning north growth, right? So we're showing where the streets could go. Some of that land's platted, some of it's not. But that's the direction of those growth areas where we're showing commercial, a village idea, low density, high density, all that stuff's going to come out for all the growth areas. So I think that's what you told us is okay to show on the map. So that's an idea of what that would look like. But for me right now, what the materials that Marty put forward on Friday is really this classification, the legend on the left. It is an atypical nomenclature because it's not using low, medium, and high, heavy, light, general, industrial. What we need to understand is, are you buying into the idea that these names, maybe they're not the perfect names, but the idea that we're describing context, not just density, is good for Ames. It helps address both the growth areas as well as the character of existing neighborhoods. Those are the kinds of things I think that we want to make sure that before RDG spends a lot more time applying this across the city, that you buy into this kind of approach, or are you more comfortable going to the more vanilla, low, medium, high, general, heavy, regional, that kind of stuff. And the text that we can't go through tonight, which you already have, describes the meaning behind some of these. And we talked about this a little bit tonight. Okay, so the accessory dwelling unit thing will get pulled out because that's not a given that that's a policy of the city. But that's really what we're looking for is contextual descriptions better than simplistic low, medium, high.
So
And then Marty can ask other questions that he needs to know too.
So what are the implications for redevelopment of existing property in these areas? And would they have new guidelines to follow?
Well, actually, I think the way that we would cover these, if there's an area in the plan that we're identifying as, say, redirection, we're going to identify that we're suggesting we identify that as such, not that it's not going to have commercial or residential or whatever uses in it. But for a policy perspective, we're going to identify that as an area that we see as being as ultimately changing in use. Now that could be accomplished by drawing a dotted line around it and using one of these other categories. But we thought it was, it's not a zoning map. It's more, in a lot of ways, more a statement of policy.
So does our zoning map go away then?
No.
No, it doesn't change at all.
Well, we might need to
You might
change the
change
zoning
it, but-
districts to reflect the concepts depicted here. But you're going to have zoning because its level of detail is just way different. than
Yeah,
this.
this is not a zoning
I
map.
misunderstood. I should have asked that question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
This is
so
not
I
zoning.
think Marty said that it isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship. So if you see an established neighborhood, that doesn't necessarily mean there's only one zoning district for all areas.
Gotcha.
So you'll have to
Right.
sort out a
You're-
little bit. Is there
you're
one or two?
categorically assigning certain areas for, this is what we want to see happen in those areas. And there's more granularity to it as you get down lower.
Yeah, and the big difference here is categorizing areas by the makeup of what's really there rather than a density expectation. Most land use maps are based on a density regardless of what the character of the neighborhood is. And it's a little more involved to describe. It's not as simplistic as, again, low, medium, high. But if it feels valuable, then we can run with that. And it helps fill in maybe a little bit more about the existing neighborhood expectations as well as the growth area expectations.
But currently you have medium and high density, right?
Yes.
So now you lump them all under multifamily neighborhood, is that what it is? So actually the property owners have gained something?
Not if you don't change zoning.
I thought you're gonna make them.
But there'll be multiple zones probably for these areas. Because again, some areas might be on a mixed use avenue and the zoning district needs to reflect that you expect on that transportation corridor a different style of that density.
Was there gonna be guidance in the plan to know how to zone the property, even though it's all multifamily neighborhood?
Yeah, there'll have to be some policy. If there's multiple zoning districts, there'll have to be reasons why one is one way
And one is another way, right.
or what factors go into that.
Or also, what kinds of actions would be compliant with the plan? So, there are plans that put zoning maps in them, but we're not going there. But it might say that a certain kind of zoning is appropriate in in the established neighborhood area along at an intersection of a boulevard and mixed-use avenue. And so if a proposal came in to do a project like that, you're not under any compulsion to approve it, but it would say that it complied with the comprehensive plan.
I think my read on this, it's new to me too. I mean, we've had this for just a little while to work with. I think this is considered more flexible from a designation perspective.
Yeah.
And you focus more on the zoning side and less on the land use side because the categories are broader. Like, let's say the typical neighborhood is 4 to 8 units per acre. Well, there's a lot of different zoning tools that you can deliver 4 to 8 units per acre, but it isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship where I have to go from low to medium low or to medium to get the desired housing option that we want to see. That's probably the biggest benefit of this, is it spends more time probably on the details and less about the high level. Is the density okay? Because usually that's where you get stuck. Is the density okay? Not the details about how it's laid out, but is the density okay? This gets away from that.
So this might result in fewer requests for amendments to the
whole-
comp plan.
I would
No.
think so.
Yeah.
Within those areas. So if you're in one of those golden areas and there's 3 zoning choices, then you just focus on the zone that's appropriate for the parameters that are set out in the plan, rather than do I go from low to medium to get 4 more units on that property that we think we're okay with being an infill site.
So-
This is, again, it hasn't all played out across the city. This is probably the easiest part of the city to show you this for, because most of it is kind of what it is.
So let me just jump to my conclusion here, and that is that this has some appeal, but my background is not in interpreting land use policy plans, and I have really no basis to say that this is going to have reliable advantages and fewer disadvantages over the previous method. If this is what the professionals are recommending, I can work with that probably, but I'll have a lot more.
I think you should
to say
be,
about that.
I think ultimately you need to be comfortable less with the map and more about the descriptions that are in the table that talk about.
And that's
what
clear
those
to me, and
things are.
I want to be clear that for all of these maps in this packet, we're not being asked to adopt any of the designations of anything in the maps.
Yeah,
right? So,
right.
But the categorization as a way to lump things together, ultimately, I think that's what the comp plan will do. It will say that everything that is, that's contiguous and is the same shade is going to have some level of similar treatment, even though there might be multiple choices within that area. Oh, okay, that works. For me.
And we wanted, and this is right now as an experiment. It says trial for a good reason, and that is we wanted to see whether, we came up with this sort of set of contexts that we described that said, okay, let's put it on a map and see what it looks like. And, it generally looks pretty good. So not just because I can color within lines, but it looked to us like it has some appeal. And now, with your sort of tentative green light, that it says, let's go ahead and do the rest of it and bring that to you next month and show you what it all looks like put together.
Mike, could you take one? I apologize. My question is probably a little more like along David's lines. So we're working on a comprehensive plan for the community. We have an established set of zoning regulations that we've been working with. Everybody's responded to. Could you help us at a high level think, what would our comprehensive plan be with the adoption of these designations and without the adoption? If we just stayed with our existing zoning regulations, how would we be better or worse off? I mean, obviously you're suggesting we'd be better off with these classifications. Could you
really
walk us through
You
that?
really
just a little
don't
bit
have
more?
to change your zoning
I
regulations.
know we don't have to.
Yeah.
My question is, could you sell us just for a minute on a little more practical, the advantage of adopting this kind of methodology?
Quick clarification. Do you mean the current land use designations in the LUPP or the actual zoning districts? Like if we just stuck with low density and medium density, or are you talking about the actual zoning districts themselves?
Well, both. I mean, we have classifications and we would apply them to the new areas.
Mhm.
We don't have to go through a process of creating traditional neighborhoods, established neighborhoods. We could accomplish the 2040 plan without that. Could you just give us a little more? I need a hook to help me into the conversation.
Okay, yes, I can. These, this kind of a classification system, and again, separated from zoning, because it's not a zoning map, although there'll be zones that are appropriate or not within each one, within each one of these. But this is intended to be more holistic policy. So in other words, when we approach neighborhoods that are post World War II, but fully built up, in those areas, there are potentially a set of policies or a set of directions or approaches to those, and specifically to an individual. Sorry about that. I got over exuberant and didn't hit the right button. I'm going in reverse. So I can point at this specific at that specific area that we call an established neighborhood, and say I can, for comprehensive plan purposes, develop a policy framework around that involves a variety of things: neighborhood connectivity, green space, trails, the look of a commercial area, the transition between, and zoning may be one element of that, but it's not the only element of it. Whereas if you use that kind of hierarchical use intensity thing, it doesn't provide any of that guidance. It says this piece of property is designated for low intensity land use, this one for medium intensity land use. And it doesn't tell you anything about what the
There's no
totality
There's
of
no
that
descriptor or
neighborhood should be.
vision for what's going to happen.
There's no
there,
vision for what it should be, yeah.
or descriptor of what's
Yeah.
trying to be accomplished in that area.
So, yeah.
I mean, there's a broad range described. It's just not contextual because it's the same label, whether it's 80 years old or 1 year old.
Yeah, so I look at an area like this, and one of the perspectives here, and the Champaign plan does this, is break these up into areas and blow them up. Not literally, but
Enlarge.
make enlarge, that's a better word. I'd be interested in the relationship of the mall to the neighborhoods around it, to the connections and approaches to those, to how that neighborhood actually functions as an entity, which I can describe through this kind of a process, but I absolutely can't describe through a traditional
Density
use
permit.
intensity.
I can give you a pretty
Yeah.
tangible example, I think, of the difference right here. But based on, let's pick, again, the mall site. We have some older 2-story apartments right across from the mall. They're not shown as high density on here. They're shown as established neighborhood because there are a few buildings kind of surrounded by single family homes. On the current map, it shows orange or brown. I don't know if it's medium or high. Well, those buildings might be aging out during the life of this plan.
Mhm.
So are you more comfortable saying, I want someone to come to me to change my plan to go from medium to high, or something along those lines where they have to come ask just for a policy question? Or do you want to set a contextual policy here and say, let's just get to the details, that those apartments, if they're going to be replaced, need to do this in this neighborhood? That's really the difference of the approach. You can get to the same place. It's which steps do you want to go through to get there? If you're more comfortable with the 2-step process, that's what we have now. This is trying to say, hey, we're okay with things that fit the neighborhood or whatever's described as context, and we're just going to deal with the details of a zone change instead.
Will this help, to David's point, I think, maybe a little bit Tim's point, reduce the requests for potential change? Will it streamline and give more vision for the people who own property and help us try and achieve a bigger vision?
I think it depends how permissive you are
Okay.
on,
Oh, yeah.
on wanting to entertain zone changes. I think that's really, it's more efficient because there's not two steps, one public hearing up front and then another one 3 months later to talk about it again. That's more efficient. But whether there's a higher volume of changes is really a question of how permissive are we on entertaining new ideas.
So efficiency isn't always the primary driver.
No.
Sometimes inefficiency is a good thing. Another way of saying is how much control or willing to give up. We can be very efficient and just cede all control and let things
That's
develop.
fair. That's
Yeah,
fair.
but it's control over one specific thing and not control over the whole of a neighborhood and what you want to see happen in that neighborhood. And that's kind of the big difference. It's almost it's almost like what's a good analogy? There's probably an analogy in traffic engineering, although I may not want to tread there, that says, if we only reduce congestion on a street from level of service E to level of service D, then we've accomplished our goal on one factor, and that's delays in traffic. When to a transportation literate planner, transportation traffic movement is much more complex than that. It relates to how does that street work in its neighborhood? Can pedestrians cross it? Does it look good? Does it protect property values around it? So this idea of departing from the sort of single variant where we'll make yes or no decisions based on whether it's colored the right way or whether there's whether its zoning complies with whatever the land use intensity category is I would say much more controlling, but controlling in a way that may or may not be significant.
So, and you've been very good. So we've got 100 years of zoning history in the United States. Is this new? Do we have a track record with this? If we're going to adopt this as a city, it'd be a little helpful to know if this has been implemented in other communities and what the results have been.
There's been phase variations on it, and so
Yeah.
community character based. In fact, the old Des Moines plan was based on just the character, and so this is really tying that back to. So previously it was about density. That was it. Density was it. This is actually looking at a little bit more of the context of the area too. So I think this is better. I think it's going to be a helpful tool for you to understand whether or not there needs to be a limit. I know we're short on time here.
I think the main benefit is if you're really into this, the infill concepts, this helps guide those levels of change, whether it's a little bit with an ADU or it's more wholesale that we're okay with different changes to housing and properties. This is more flexible in that sense. If we're not really invested in infill concepts, there's probably not a lot of reasons to break apart the existing city into these different ideas and different contexts. We could deal with it differently, more simplistically.
So I want to go back to my earlier question about the near campus neighborhoods, which we adopted by resolution with a map that we're using for the parking ordinance now, the game day parking ordinance. So we already have that category of neighborhoods that are not actually reflected in here because we've got traditional neighborhoods.
We haven't gotten there yet.
Well, but the definitions, okay, traditional neighborhoods are associated with downtown, and they don't really seem to be those near campus neighborhoods. And university neighborhoods seem to be the high density areas that are actually the university impacted overlay zones, which are not part of the near campus neighborhoods. So those near campus neighborhoods, from my perspective as a resident of one of them, don't really fit. They're a hybrid of impact from the university and lots of university staff and faculty who live in them, not connected to downtown, but they're those areas where you do have that conflict between the high density and the low density at the margins.
Yeah. I'll be able to tell you next month what the approach to those areas
So we don't
I'm
have
not
to.
totally sure yet.
Okay, because I noticed that the one university impacted or near campus neighborhood that is on this map, which is Oak to Riverside, has nothing on top of it there. So right at the bottom, you've got Brookside Park coming up in the middle, and then
Right
there's
down.
that area. That is the Oak to Riverside neighborhood. So it's not indicated as
It's
university or
shown as
traditional.
That is established neighborhood.
That is, okay,
Yeah.
because it doesn't look green,
You-
but
No, it's
It's
tan.
a light
tan.
color.
You can't,
Established. It's the second one down.
yeah.
so.
It's
This
colored.
looks like it's-
Well, so my concern with that is then when I look at the next map, which I know we haven't talked about yet, is that I see the lower part of that is designated as residential mixed high, and the northern
Next
part of it is
slide.
residential
Next
mixed
slide.
middle.
Yeah, I think we're probably junking this, by the way.
So anyway,
So I think this is a
I'm
little in the
confused
weeds.
because that's the only
Yeah.
near campus neighborhood that
Yeah.
appears in this
Yeah, I don't
quadrant.
think, this was an experiment because we did the other map and then said, well, maybe there needs to be a second map that kind of gets into the other thing that Tim was talking about, that's much more kind of conventional, density zone, commercial intensity related.
Got back to density.
And I think we've come to the conclusion that, beside the fact that the colors are not as pretty and the marker didn't work as well, that this isn't necessarily where we want to be.
Okay, so we can
This-
This is
disregard
just
that
a
one.
draft to
Well, this
Yeah.
is more indication of existing character
Yeah,
to help influence the creation of the
Okay.
the colorful
The other map.
ones. Because Oak Riverside, that south part has some apartments and other things.
Couple.
It's more intense than the other side. So if you're just talking about intensity of use, you can see these bubbles are quite a bit different from the other map, where you start to pick up where duplexes are and fourplexes and apartments. We're not proposing to use this to regulate anything. This was really an example of existing conditions. We've decided, Marty just said that, we're decided we don't want to move forward in this as a regulatory tool to guide decisions. We
Okay,
want it to be on
Great.
one lane.
Let's give staff direction and RDG direction. Is everyone comfortable with the prior slide, following this approach?
And to be clear, I think following up on Gloria's point, you've only done a quarter of the city. And so
Yeah, a quarter of
as you examine more of the city, you might find other categories
Correct.
emerge. And so it's not necessarily.
This is the
this
concept.
list.
This is the
Right.
the
It's the
concept-
concept.
conceptually.
Yeah, this
following
is
this approach.
way.
Okay, so I was concerned because we were also looking at the chart, which did not have that kind of near campus neighborhood described.
True.
And so I don't want that to get lost. We spent, a year and a half developing a concept of this area that has unique influences acting on it. And it seems like reinventing the wheel if we suddenly say, well, it's not really that, it's this and this other thing. And so that's my concern.
Since I know what you're talking about, Marty probably doesn't. Are you literally asking for us to add another category that reflects the near campus parking restrictions and see if that works in the overall matrix? Or where are you trying to go with the
I
near
think
campus label?
when we initially adopted the resolution to establish the definition of near campus neighborhoods, it was during the rental cap
Right.
discussions, right? And we adopted the resolution that has a flexible map that we could change if necessary, thanks to Mark's guidance. And so when the parking discussions came up, we said, well, we've already got this resolution for what a near campus neighborhood is. Let's use that as our guidance for where we apply the parking. So the parking is kind of aside from the main point. Main point is we developed a definition for near campus neighborhoods that has a map with it.
But what if
Okay,
we
so
only
that's a
develop
very
that?
simple question then is, do you want us to add that category that reflects the geography of that map? That's the simple question that I think is
So
on the table.
from my perspective, yes, because the two categories that I see that could apply, traditional and university, do not reflect what happens in those near campus neighborhoods. They are not near downtown and they are highly impacted by the university.
Go ahead, Rob.
So,
I was just going to say, I mean, didn't we sort of develop those neighborhoods and define them because council wasn't entirely comfortable with doing a rental cap on the whole city? But other than that, the characteristics of those neighborhood, we haven't, that was it was just the rental capacity and the rental what would you say, saturation that we used to define those neighborhoods. So to me, they don't really necessarily, they're not that vital to me once the rental cap is gone, because
so
they
they're
were
vital to ADUs or conversion discussions.
not
'Cause to
necessarily.
me,
No, I
they
mean,
are.
not necessarily. If there's a different category that they could be seen as, maybe that, maybe established or something. I don't know, and
Be more traditional.
Well,
Right.
but another level that we think we're going to go in is that we, within, I mean, this is really to keep the map relatively simple and clear, but that in addition to that, where there are special issues or special policies that apply to one geography, in other words, one established neighborhood is not necessarily like another established neighborhood, that those areas are expanded and dealt with in the plan, expanded and shown in more detail. So for example, in the near campus areas that really don't fall in a university neighborhood category, we actually address those with a almost like a pull out that looks at the history and the issues and the current strategies and practices within that neighborhood. And I think that probably is more effective than.
That's fine. If you deal with that, I would prefer then that the characteristics of the category not say proximity to downtown.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Well,
these are traditional neighborhoods that are not right near downtown.
Yeah.
So they don't really fit the way it's
Right.
described now.
Okay,
downtown's
anything
such a
else?
campus town.
So you want us, so to summarize,
Yep.
you want us to move forward with a more descriptive labeling convention than the standard low, medium, high. Obviously, you need to see how it's applied to make sure you're understanding that. You want us to definitely look at the non-university label around the university and see that if it's distinct or call outs are better. Okay, we can work with that. That helps us know where to go. Yep. So that would mean with that direction, we're going to prepare a citywide map, and then you're going to be able to say, hey, this area doesn't make sense, or we don't like this classification, and what does it all mean? That's where this goes from here.
Okay, what else do you need from us tonight?
That's all I need tonight.
I have a question just about your process there. It's going to take you some work to actually do that, right? Because the current map designation says, going from the land use policy plan to zoning, it has sort of like arrows saying if you're in this sort of land use policy designation, then these zonings are permissible, right?
Most of the time, not always.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe not enough, but still you have to repeat that sort of exercise with the new map scheme.
Yeah.
Ultimately to
Yeah,
indicate
yeah.
which zonings, is that what you'll be doing?
The first step will be to just do this.
Okay.
And then
just get-
it'll probably be incumbent on me to kind of think through how zoning works, because RDG is not really into the zoning code there at this level. So that'll probably be
I
once
see.
we get to an RDG created land use map, I'll have to probably do the assessment of what does it mean for zoning or not work for zoning.
Okay, so not immediately, but that's something that you feel can be done effectively in the long run if it sort of
Well,
meets with,
Yeah, I think we'll have to. So the first full map to the city probably won't have all of the zoning categories that go with it, because we want to make sure it works. And then we'll have to do that as we work through the full review of the plan, that we know how zoning would have to be changed to implement it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Other feedback or input?
I wonder what Robbie's going to put in his article for tomorrow. This is complicated stuff.
It could take up the whole paper.
Okay, so
Not that.
next steps is Kelly and Steve and I are talking this afternoon about the next desired meeting, and they'd like to have another meeting in March. Now, the week of the 15th or 16th, I think.
So
is
your
spring
standard
break.
workshop date is during spring break.
It's fine
So
with me.
that's a question of whether there's
So-
enough
So the
attendance.
question is, and I know I talked to Rachel and she asked about that, and I said that we probably may not have, or probably wouldn't have a workshop. But also I didn't know about Gloria and David and Tim and also Amber. So we don't prefer to have everyone here if at all possible. And what's the topic of the conversation next time?
It should be the land use map and then parks open. It's kind of those remaining categories you need to get filled in. Parks, open space, maybe.
Environment.
I'll look at our content to make sure it's balanced.
Yeah.
3 hours.
Yeah, I think the map's the key one.
Good luck.
Because if you're not going to buy off on that, it
Because
can't really finish the plan.
here are the options. Option one is if everyone was going to be here, do it the week of spring break. Option
The
two,
17th.
the 17th.
Yeah.
St. Patrick's Day.
What's that?
St. Patrick's Day.
Okay. Option two is to put a tentative hold or look at the agenda, but try and do it on the 24th, our regular council meeting,
Boy.
which is dangerous.
Or the 31st.
31st.
Or the 31st. I will not be here, but that's not a problem. So the point is, Amber can run the meeting. But the point is that those are the options. So spring break week, is everyone here, not here?
Here.
What's that?
I'll most likely be gone.
Okay. Tim,
I'll be here.
I'll be here.
David?
Yes.
And we don't know about Amber.
Right.
Okay.
That works for me too. 17th is.
How about the 30? How about the? I just I'm very perceptive. I just got this idea that the 24th is not desirable, so we'll punt on that one. So it had to be the 31st would be the other option.
31st.
Here?
31st.
Did you find a venue?
31st.
That is
Find a venue?
not so great for me,
Okay.
but
What'd you find?
that's a tentative day-long thing in Johnson County, Kansas.
So if we did it on the 17th, I'm not saying we're going to. What would Rachel be missing then?
Presentation of the citywide land use map.
31st gives us
Showing
more
that
time.
The full format applied to the whole city.
Can you get it done by then?
Yeah,
Well,
that could be tight.
I mean, that would be our goal. I mean, we have to go from
Okay.
tonight and
Then
see
you
what
probably
we're
should
gonna
probably
do.
plan for 31st then, sounds like.
Yeah,
That's much safer.
it's safe.
Okay.
But I don't want to go past that because it
Okay.
gets elongated. But Marty wasn't sure he could make that
Yeah, well-
from another.
Oh, that's
committee.
right.
That would be probably, let's make that work. I think we're far enough out that we, on the other thing, that we can make that.
Oh, where? Which one?
Go to
The
April Fool's
31st.
Day or something.
So plan on the 31st.
I think it'd be hard to get this whole map done by the 17th.
31st.
Yeah, 31st.
So no workshop on the 17th, taking that off. Okay.
No, we're gonna do it on the 24th to be the 31st. Okay,
Great meeting.
all right, council
I'll
comments,
sleep well tonight.
council comments, Brahman.
I just want, thanks to the audience members. That was good job sitting through all that. That's all.
David,
Nothing tonight.
color?
Nothing.
Nothing.
So I have something kind of cool. It's National Engineers Week. So we had a kind of a cool event at Iowa State this afternoon with the research park. So we brought in about 8 different companies to talk about different engineering opportunities for students and talk about the cool research and technology that they're developing there. It was a great collaborative event, and we also have a keynote speaker coming up on Thursday. Kate Darling is a professor at MIT, and she's going to speak at Thursday at 7 p.m. in the Great Hall of the Memorial Union about human-robot interaction. So thought it was a cool opportunity to recognize all the engineers in our community and those who support the work they do.
Great, thank you. Nice. Anything else? Anything else? All right, I met with the student government president and also Devin last Friday, worked on an agenda. He's putting an agenda together for our joint meeting.
Was that?
That's March 4th
And they're planning on starting at 5:30. Not 6, but 5:30. And I think there's going to be adequate time at the end for conversation and open questions both ways. But look for the agenda probably to be coming out here shortly. So that's only in a couple of weeks.
His office.
Okay, moving on, disposition of communication of the council. There are 3 items. One's a memo from Kelly.
So there's no action there. I encourage the commission to be able to meet and talk about this. They seem to be off cycle every time we had a meeting. So they were very eager to kind of, without the presentation, be able to talk about some of the stuff. So they wanted to give you some thoughts as you continue to work on this. They're probably the only other group that's somewhat actively tracking this, that where they're engaged with staff on a regular basis. So if you ever want to refer something down or have them to look in more detail at something, please let me know and we'll make sure there's a meeting that happens, because sometimes it's on an as-needed basis with the commission. They don't meet every Wednesday just because it's on this calendar.
Okay.
And ultimately, they do have to review and make a recommendation to the plan. So it's important to keep them in the loop.
Second is letter from Justin Dodge regarding regional improvements at State Avenue and Zumwalt Station Road.
Do you have a preference on?
I refer to memo, I think. I'm not sure. Yeah, I haven't read it. I'm not sure what he wants. Memo, I think.
Motion to refer to staff.
Will we refer for a memo?
For a second?
Second.
Yeah.
All right, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. And the last is regarding a expanded no parking zone on Westbrook Drive.
Yes, if I could mention, I've been in touch with the neighbors about this, and I think Clark lays out the situation pretty clearly. I would move to refer this letter to staff with the request to see if staff can try to find a way to provide on-street parking in that neighborhood.
Is there a second?
Second,
All right.
and I just want to ask for clarification
Sure.
then. So is it the intent that the memo is supposed to present us with the option either, no, we can't do this, or here's how we do it? Or is it just
Make it happen.
make it happen? Yeah.
I would accept either. I mean, if
Wasn't that a council action in terms of setting no parking or parking?
yeah,
zone
we
on
would
the
have to
streets?
act on it ultimately.
ordinance.
So they can't, so staff can't
So
say
I
we're going to
guess
do it this way.
I was imagining a memo that would advise us either how we could proceed to provide on-street parking if it is possible, or would advise us that there's some an impediment that makes it impossible.
Okay.
So, Aaron, are you clear on that motion or not? Okay. Everyone clear? Probably look puzzled.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think how I'm going to vote. But yeah, I'm clear on the motion.
Okay, all right. Any further discussion? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. All right,
So does that.
entertain a motion to adjourn.
Rachel, you're up.
Move to adjourn.
We are adjourned. Thank you.